Hey guys, welcome to the channel. As you see in the thumbnail, what if Ichigo become a demigod of Hallow's part 1. Before I start, please do support for more awesome content and subscribe my channel and like this video. Go support and follow the Shapooda for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story, link in the description. Let's start this video. Giving Grimmjow the tools he needed to use La Sanger to travel was one of the most convenient things Ichigo had ever done. Grimmjow fucking hated being delegated to the messenger errand boy, but he had a feeling the Arrancar relished the freedom. Taking notes from Medalas and the medallion she'd crafted for the Sternritter, Ichigo condensed La Sanger into a small coin shape. Took him long enough to figure out how to keep it from simply rejoining the desert, but he managed. He even put a little design on it, a panther. Grimmjow got a kick out of that, especially since Ichigo didn't indulge his Hollow's insistence on making it a kitten. Grimmjow couldn't use it to move about outside Hueco Mundo without a good deal of effort, but it certainly worked more efficiently than Zenith. They had put together a loose system where Ichigo would stabilize the borders of Hueco Mundo, and Grimmjow would scout ahead, looking for the worst of it. Stabilizing consisted of concentrating and letting his instinct soothe La Sanger back into a wavelength that was more normal and less chaotic. It would settle on its own, but the dang guy needed to be traversable again within their lifetimes. While Ichigo worked, La Sanger saved Grimmjow from having to Zenith the whole way back once he found a physical point of contact where La Sanger was a bit too aggressive. Despite the fact that they frequented the borders of Hueco Mundo, they ran into plenty of hollows. That was fine with Ichigo, he needed fodder to leave with Sail. He hadn't forgotten about Sterk, and his conscience hadn't caved under the weight of tearing apart the souls of hollows. There was an arrogance that he couldn't pretend didn't exist, an arrogance he'd seen in Mechlin that whispered that these hollows were his. Indulging that small voice under the guise of the greater good was likely a bad idea, but he did it nonetheless. His inner spirits couldn't counsel him on morality, they were weapons first, they protected his soul, but not from bad moral judgment. If he was alive and sane, they were perfectly happy. Ichigo stepped from La Sanger and dropped an unconscious, bleeding Ajuchas behind Sail. The scientist flinched, then slowly turned, overcompensating for being startled at all. The Arrancar wrinkled his nose in disgust. Must you do that? Sneak up on you? Sail shot him an unamused look, crouching down before the Ajuchas. Sully my lab. I have to get my kick somehow, Ichigo said. Fighting with Zangetsu was overkill, but fighting with claws was bloody and a bit more entertaining. It was also messy, or rather, it had been messy. All hollows were born from La Sanger. In the midst of figuring out how to make Grimmjow a travel medallion, he'd figured out how to use La Sanger to eat the blood off of him, and with practice, got it to devour any blood on Grimmjow without La Sanger trying to eat Grimmjow. Almost perfect, Sail muttered, gingerly rolling the Ajuchas to its back. He kept saying that, and Ichigo could only assume the Arrancar was talking about him, even if he didn't know what the fuck he was on about. Taking a small pink cube from his jacket, Sail dropped it into the hole in the Ajucha's chest. It hovered there, suspended, and Ichigo knew by then that it paralyzed weaker hollows. He didn't know why it was pink, he just assumed that was artistic license. Sail's Frachian had mysteriously disappeared, which left Sail to do all the dirty work himself. He was the black sheep of the Arrancar, thanks to all the negative attention Ichigo showed him, on top of his shitty attitude. No other Arrancar wanted any part of that. That left Sail with little assistance, and after the disappearance of his first Frachian, Ichigo couldn't say he felt sorry for him. Ichigo asked, as he usually did. Any progress? Sail looked at him from beneath his mask. You bring me weak Ajuchas that can barely withstand a bit of prodding, and you expect results. He let out a derisive snort and stood. If you bring me trash to work with, Kurosaki, do not be surprised when the results are trash. This is what's out there, make it work, Ichigo said. If I had an Arrancar. Sail always tried, and Ichigo's answer was always the same. No. Ichigo shifted to leave, but this time Sail stopped him. Wait. Ichigo paused, as Sail lifted a tablet from the desk behind him. It's well known that your ability to sense others is abysmal. Grimmjow is better, but his own abilities are dampened by his connection to your soul. How do you know that? Ichigo asked. He hadn't told him, and Sail hadn't had contact with Grimmjow in months. I'm observant, Sail said, and it didn't really answer Ichigo's question. Ichigo could only assume he'd been watching Grimmjow from a distance before all the business with Sunyata. His conclusion might have very well been drawn from the fact that neither of them noticed him. What's your point? Ichigo asked. Given you can't find a suitable test subject, I started looking for you. He touched the screen, then turned it around and handed it to him. He'd seen similar swaths of color when Sail was showing him Maltese's influence. There was a streak of black going through the screen, with various dots of color scattered throughout. He felt like he was looking at a confusing and complicated weather map. What am I looking at? Sail explained, a trench. The flavor of these hollows Ryatsu is more like Grimmjow, or yours. It's been tainted by Altiza. Ichigo's eyes snapped to Sail's. How long have you been sitting on this information? Sail waved him off. A couple of days since you last decided to dump garbage in my lab. His eyes held a manic edge as he continued, I found them, I want one. A test subject like that might even live. Casting his senses out for a landmark like that, Ichigo handed the tablet back and answered, I'll think about it. Think hard, Kurosaki, Sail advised. Most things are possible, they're only determined by how badly you want it. He laughed, the sound not entirely sane. You of all people should know that. I don't need a sermon, Ichigo growled. Sail shrugged and fell back in his chair. As you say. Ichigo left before he felt even more of a desire to kill Sail. The rancor had a point. He reappeared a few feet before Grimjo, the Espada sprawled out napping on a quartz-like wedge of protruding bone. This far out, that was far more common than the ruins he'd fixed, but this area in particular was littered with quartz arches and splintered spires. The shorter ones made decent lookouts and escapes from the sand. Grimjo sensed his mood and sat up. I know Sail is a piece of work, but he usually doesn't piss you off this bad. What did he say? Ichigo said, shockingly, this time, it's what he did. Sort of. Grimjo slipped from his perch, waiting for some explanation. I think he might have found conduits. Grimjo's eyes widened. What? Why didn't you sense them? Grimjo had a personal stake in this. If there were conduits and they were still alive, it shone some light on his future, a uncertain future that neither of them could shake. Ichigo said, there's probably a few reasons for that. Primarily, I'm bad at it. It could also be that they're so assimilated they don't feel like individuals anymore. That was an unpleasant thought. Grimjo mirrored his sentiments with a grumble, lovely. Ichigo continued, Sail says he found Ryatsu's signatures at the bottom of a trench. Might take a while for me to line up my mental map with a real one, but I'll find it. The trench? Grimjo questioned. Yeah, a really deep hole. I know what a trench is, Grimjo snapped. Why a trench? The deeper you go, the denser La Sanger is. Remember when we were ditching the Hejoku with Altiza? Grimjo made a face, absently lifting his hand to his chest. Yeah, how could I fucking forget? Ichigo hadn't wanted to consider what exactly was at the bottom of that drop. Likely something similar to what he felt outside the world, and he wasn't eager to go back. So we find them then what? Grimjo asked. They can't possibly be friendly. They would have to have been Miklin's conduits to still be alive. I want to know how they're holding up. That was a pretty optimistic way to frame it, it probably wasn't going to be pretty. Grimjo looked unsettled, grumbling, I'm not sure I want to know. Well, I do. You don't have to come, Ichigo pointed out. He sat, cross-legged. He was so used to the stance for Jinzen, he saw no reason to try anything else. I'm going, Grimjo snarled. I'm not scared. Ichigo rolled his eyes and closed them, concentrating. Yeah, heard it all before. Grimjo at least lapsed into silence and let him focus. He extended his awareness down into the desert, searching for subtleties, unlike what he usually did. When he reached for La Sanger, he normally separated things into hollows, sand, and La Sanger, he hadn't ever thought to break it down further than that. Now he had to actually look, and after long moments letting his consciousness sink into the darker recesses of his soul, he opened his eyes. He wasn't seeing what was before him, he was seeing Hueco Mundo from within, and apart from it. It was a strange way to look, but it was easier than casting his senses out for all of Hueco Mundo at once, it stretched his awareness too thin. It was no wonder Miklin hadn't had to try to find him. Now that he was looking, he could pick out the familiar kinship of a conduit, albeit one many hundreds of years removed from himself. He dragged his consciousness back and blinked, disoriented for a few seconds, while he got used to the shift in perspective. Found them. Extending a hand to Grimjo, the Espada wrinkled his nose and took a step back. I ain't gonna hold your hand, Kurosaki. You're a conduit, but this isn't exactly safe, and I'm a terrible guardian. Ichigo laid out an ultimatum. You're going to hold my hand, or you're going to stay here. He saw Grimjo physically fight with a reflexive insult. I don't bite, Ichigo added dryly. Grimjo growled, PFF, yet. Last game of Do See Do we played you dislocated my arm. Sorry, Ichigo said flatly. Grimjo bared his teeth and slapped his arm down in his hand, gripping his forearm. Don't sorry me, you ain't sorry. Ichigo chuckled. Yeah, I'm not. Brace yourself. Where we're going, the Reishi is as dense as La Sanger. By that point, Grimjo knew when he told him to buckle up, he wasn't fucking around. His grip tightened along with every wire-strung muscle in the Ranker's body. At least he was prepared. Ichigo pulled them through La Sanger into the depths. Their new environment was dark, and it was cold. Bitterly cold and heavy, even for Ichigo. It was a spiritual heaviness that didn't necessarily weigh on his limbs like gravity, but it pulled at him, the brush of what felt like hands ghosting over his skin. From the way Grimjo's legs nearly buckled, he didn't think the Arankor was having quite the same experience. The Arankor flinched, jerking Ichigo's grip on his arm with a startled hiss. "The fuck is this, Kurosaki?" His voice fell flat with nothing to bounce off of, muffled in his ears. Ichigo answered, "Altiza. If it gets to be too much, I'm sending you back." Grimjo flinched violently into him like a panicked animal. Grimjo. Situating himself so his back was almost flush against Ichigo's, the Arankor answered, "Fine, I'm fine." Grimjo's voice was strained, and it was no wonder. Good instincts made this hell, and if Ichigo wasn't used to it, it would have been no different for him. Ichigo stood silently, focusing on the dark, and Grimjo eventually asked, voice hushed, "Can you see?" Ichigo's answer was concise. "Yes." He watched the shadows congeal and shift, his brain catching the pattern even before he was sure what he was looking at. He tilted his head, watching the thing in morbid curiosity. The shade looked humanish, wandering, either oblivious or uncaring of his presence. "Kurosaki." Ichigo tugged on La Sanger, disrupting the shade's existence. It froze, then lunged with an empty, hollow howl. Grimjo jerked back, instinctively reacting, but Ichigo had a firm grip on his jacket. The shade moved at ludicrous speed, but it didn't matter. All it took was a thought to trap the shade mid-motion, the shadows that comprised its form shivering, frozen in its purpose. It was nothing but a mess of instinct and impulse and darkness, bound by his will through Altiza. It was pitiful, it barely felt alive at all. If Ichigo was more merciful, he might have destroyed it. "Relax, Grimjo," Ichigo said, "it can't hurt you." Not when he was hovering right over it, he'd have to be unconscious to not be able to handle something so inexorably tied to La Sanger. "And see shit," Grimjo complained. Ichigo took a step closer, seeing nothing on this shade that could identify it as a soul, or anything that might have made it a hollow. "I got it, you're safe," Ichigo reassured him. "Then what's taking so long?" Grimjo demanded. Ichigo tilted his head, wondering what held it together in a human form. "Memories. I don't want it to fall apart." "You're not gonna keep it." "Hush, I'm right here," Ichigo snapped. "Give me a minute." He reached out for it, sticking his arm through its chest. It was like sticking his arm into a cloud, there was no resistance at all, but there was a wash of feelings, dull and distant, as if he was touching a hollow's heart. Removing his hand, Ichigo wrapped La Sanger in and around it, then pulled them all through La Sanger to the surface. Ichigo took his time with the shade, letting Grimjo go once they reached the surface. Grimjo jerked back, startled by the presence of a thing he didn't even know was there up until a few seconds ago. "How you holding up?" Ichigo asked. "Fine," Grimjo growled. He sounded rattled, but he was recovering more quickly than he might have in the past. The Espada had seen enough nightmares to get over it when it was actually harmless. "The fuck is that?" "A shadow," Ichigo answered. "It feels like a ghost, a bundle of blurry memories and forgotten feelings." "Poetic," Grimjo grumbled. Ichigo shot him a look. "Just telling you what I felt." It stood there, purposeless, and started to lose shape. Ichigo hit it with more of La Sanger, keeping it swirling around the shade just to be safe. Without veritable life support, it wasn't going to last. "It used to be a hollow?" Grimjo asked. The Espada risked getting closer, still tense and jumpy. "Doesn't have a hollow hole. I don't think you could even call it alive at this point." The other two were in similar shape. When they were this deteriorated, Ichigo doubted there was a difference between them. Grimjo's voice held an edge Ichigo couldn't identify. "This'll happen to me?" Ichigo turned to look at him, grimacing. "No, I don't think so." Grimjo stared back at him, eyes narrowed. "Why not?" Mictlan was killed by Adalas, these conduits had no way to siphon enough of La Sanger to stay alive, not without a host around. "So if you die," Grimjo trailed off, filling in the blanks himself. "I need La Sanger to live." "You saw what happened to Candace." Ichigo thought Grimjo was aware of that, but apparently he hadn't done his job in explaining it. "Think of yourself like an addict, with no hope of recovery." "Goddamn, Kurosaki, you don't pull punches." Ichigo snorted. "I do, but you can't say I coddle you." "You held my hand like a fucking chaperone," Grimjo argued. Ichigo smirked and decided to save Grimjo's pride and not call him out. He did give him a better answer. "Altiza can be greedy, and I didn't want you to get lost." He thought Grimjo paled a bit at that comment. The Espada knew he worded things lightly and that the situation was probably far worse than he anticipated. "Why did you let me go, then?" Ichigo circled the shade and answered absently, "Builds character." "What the fuck does that mean? How do you build character if you're dead?" "You're fine." Grimjo growled something under his breath, something that was probably an insult, and left him to his task. Ichigo said, "I'll be back." He didn't wait for Grimjo to respond before he jumped back to Sale's lab. The scientist was startled, albeit less startled since he was actually facing him this time around. Sale opened his mouth to complain, then his eyes focused on what he brought. Once he realized it wasn't the vestiges of his jump into his lab. Any annoyance was quickly forgotten. What is this? He got closer and reached out to touch. It seems the scientist was no more immune to curiosity than anyone else. Ichigo caught his wrist before his could make contact and said, "Your shade. Who knows if you'll even be able to study it, it's made up of La Sanger to its core. Can you sense anything?" Sale took his hand back, heeding his silent warning, and circled it, careful not to let La Sanger touch him. His answer was distracted, already lost in his own thoughts. Not much. Sharp eyes snapped to Ichigo. What do you sense? Remains of a heart, broken memories. Ichigo suppressed a shrug. It's a lot like a heavily diluted hollow. It's mostly an amalgamation of instincts. I don't sense a distinct soul, or souls, just flickers. Is that as elaborate as you can get? Sale asked. From the look Ichigo shot at him, he assumed as much and said, if it doesn't even feel like a soul, it likely won't be helpful to your little project. Ichigo said, I give it to you, or kill it. I see no reason to let it go to waste. Sale chuckled. Callous, Kurosaki. He ignored the comment and said, when you've learned all you can, tell me. It needs a steady stream of La Sanger to keep its form. Sale turned to the computer and spoke incredulously, as you wish. Ichigo frowned at him and jumped back to Grimjo, annoyed again. The Espada growled, always puts you in a bad mood. Don't act like you're any better. Didn't say I was, Grimjo said, straightening with a stretch. So what now? More work. Ichigo scoffed, there's always going to be more work. I'm going to go to Soul Society. For what purpose? Grimjo demanded. The Espada didn't like Soul Society much. To be fair, neither did Ichigo. Sometimes he got shouted at, which was a treat. Too many people staring, too many people in general. At least in Hueco Mundo, if he got claustrophobic in a crowd, he didn't feel so bad killing someone. Ichigo answered, to try something, and I also want to look for shades. Shades? The broken conduits. What for? They're useless. Mainly, said Ichigo, to find the greatest concentration of Kujeki. And I'm curious what happens to their soul when they die. If it even is a soul, Grimjo reminded. Exactly. Grimjo gestured dismissively. Then let's get it over with. He added sarcastically, I can't wait to go somewhere I hate so I can come back and do work. Ichigo rolled his eyes. I forgot, you have a busy schedule entirely comprised of self-sustenance, fighting, and recovering from said fight. Grimjo grinned like this was positive, and Ichigo sighed. Let's just go. XXX. Iraku Shunsui. He often wondered how there could still be so much desk work to do when there was barely a real desk to work from. Sometimes when he was up late at night staring down at paper, he wished the semi-apocalypse had destroyed all paper. He was deeply grateful to hear Kurosaki had shown up. The lack of notice might have annoyed others, but frankly, Kairaku could only treat it like a well-deserved break. Normally when Kurosaki showed up, the hybrid worked and he got to watch. Stepping from his glorified tent into the street, he walked from the center of their camp to the eastern edge, meeting Kurosaki where they always met. The tree was huge, its branches stretched high enough to be seen from the opposite edge of the camp. It was a decent beacon, and also a decent walk, but Kurosaki made it clear he wasn't interested in wandering through a crowd of people that feared him. He caught sight of Ichigo's Frachian first, the Espada sprawled beneath the tree sleeping. When he approached, without opening his eyes, the Espada knocked on the base of the tree and shouted, Oi! Kurosaki. The Espada still hadn't moved or opened his eyes, but that wasn't unusual. Kairaku caught movement among the branches and watched as Kurosaki stepped from his perch, landing in an easy crouch when his feet struck the ground. Straightening, Kurosaki lifted his hand in a half-hearted wave and said, Hey, you're looking, he hesitated, well. Kairaku grinned. Liar, I'm exhausted. I look every bit my age. Ichigo laughed. Well, there's no fixing that, so I wasn't going to say anything. What brings you here? Kairaku asked. It wasn't like chit-chat wasn't nice, but if he let himself procrastinate, he wasn't ever going to get back to work. I counted about the hybrid looked up and thought, lessening his violent appearance. About 200 or so Shinigami stranded in the living world. I figure I'll swap them out. They've been stuck in living world for a while now, they probably want to come home and see what's happened. It wasn't as if they couldn't make a Sinkamen, but the way was still too dangerous to cross without heavy risk, so he'd forbidden anyone to try. Kurosaki noted his confusion and elaborated. Grimjo opened an eye, scowling at Kurosaki. That's why we're here. Why do they get a pass? Because Shinigami don't eat people, Kurosaki said. I have enough unruly hollows without adding to the bunch because the Shinigami can't do their job. Grimjo closed his eyes again. Fair enough. Glad I have your approval, Kurosaki muttered sarcastically. Iraku asked, unruly hollows. Kurosaki explained briefly. Starving hollows turn violent real fast. That sounded like a bigger issue than Kurosaki was making it, but the hybrid didn't elaborate. Iraku said, "That's surprisingly thoughtful, Kurosaki-san." Kurosaki tilted his head, regarding him curiously. When the hybrid barely blinked at all, it made him look decidedly inhuman. He tried not to snoop, but the best way Iraku could label the emotions he felt from him would be surprise. Kurosaki's pause only lasted a moment before a bemused smile crossed his face. "I might have a hole in my chest, but I'm not heartless." Iraku wasn't sure if he could recover from that accusation. I didn't mean to imply." Grimjo snorted loudly and said, "He fucking knows what you mean, he's messing with you." Ichigo gave Kairaku a forgiving look. "Your doubt is deserved. I'm not known for being." He searched for an appropriate word and in the end, he settled. "Nice." Iraku said, "You're very practical." "I am," Ichigo agreed, "so I can't collect any points for morality, because this costs me nothing but my time and works in my favor." "How would you bring them here?" Losanger. He'd seen the effect that it had on hollows, he couldn't imagine what it felt like for Shinigami. Kurosaki alleviated those concerns. "Actually, I was going to use the Kujeki. I'm better with Losanger because, well," he gestured at himself like that was explanation enough, and Kairaku thought it was a pretty compelling argument. "I can't promise it won't be unpleasant, I haven't actually used it on anyone but myself, but it'll be a damn sight better than Losanger." "You're confident that it's safe?" Kurosaki finished. "Any discomfort seems to be temporary, at least as far as Losanger and hollows are concerned." He held up his hand and from his claws downward, his arm began to disappear, distorted as if through some rippled lens. The light bent around the edge, like a singed prismatic line, and Kairaku noted that it was actually rather pretty, if not very jarring. Kurosaki waved the Kujeki away and said, "I practiced. I'll get more efficient with time, so it may still be unpleasant, but it's an option. It's up to you if you want to use it." Iraku could see the extra effort Kurosaki made to try to hold himself in check. The hybrid went out of his way to leave the actual decisions up to Kairaku himself. It went beyond thoughtful, the hybrid was well aware of what he was and all of the implications that came with it. If Kurosaki wanted, he could kill them all, he could demand respect, but he had discovered it was rather difficult to get under Kurosaki's skin. At least, he hadn't seen anyone cross a line around him. The only one that didn't seem to be even wary of Kurosaki was Grimjo, and from the way they acted and the Ranker's position, it seemed to be a right that had been well earned. Taking all of that into account, Kairaku said, "I'll leave it up to the individual." He gave Kurosaki a sad smile. "People are nervous enough around you, I won't be making it any better by ordering them into an unpleasant situation." He caught Grimjo staring at him, the look on his face bitterly thoughtful, until he caught Kairaku's eyes and looked away. Iraku called him out about it, if something was on Grimjo's mind, eventually Kurosaki would know about it. "You disagree?" Grimjo huffed then stood, shoving his hands in his pockets. "Pisses me off is all. Fear, I get, but hatred." He didn't quite face him, clearly disinterested in engaging this particular topic. Kurosaki looked like he'd heard this before, shooting Grimjo a chiding look. If it bothered the hybrid, Kairaku didn't feel it. Then again, Kurosaki was unfortunate enough to have been feared for a long time, he wouldn't be surprised if he was used to it. Iraku said, "Kurosaki-san is something different, something new, and to some, a scapegoat. These people had loved ones just disappear, they had their home destroyed. They never saw Ryuze, so the only person left to hate is Kurosaki-san. Give it time." "It's fine, Grimjo." Grimjo ignored him and snarled, "How's that fair?" "It isn't, but people are complicated, Grimjo-san." The Ranker's eyes narrowed, looking a lot like he wanted to leave, but he stayed stubbornly rooted in place. From the uncomfortable look on Kurosaki's face, this was a frequent topic and one he didn't like to revisit. The hybrid was all too eager to change the subject. "I doubt the Shinigami in Living World are fully aware of the situation." Kairaku knew Urahara had reached out to the Shinigami stationed in Living World as a favor, but Shinigami in Living World were hard to get a hold of. They were counted on to check in, and with all the chaos, there was no one to check in with. Kurosaki continued, "I need to touch them to bring them with me, for one thing, and for another, I doubt they'll recognize me by sight, and if they do, look at me." He looked like a particularly dangerous Ranker. Kairaku grim sound of agreement. "That's very true. I'll need to send you with someone they'll recognize and trust." Kurosaki threw out a shot in the dark. "How well known is Rukia?" Iraku hummed in thought. "Well, she is a member of the Kichiki clan, and her rank has been the source of some under-the-table gossip for quite some time. There's a good chance they'll recognize her." That seemed to brighten Kurosaki's mood, asking, "She can come with us?" It was almost out of place to see such an unfiltered emotion in the other. Kairaku was caught off guard by it. Even if his mind wasn't already made up, he didn't think he'd have the heart to crush his hopes. He chuckled and said, "Of course. If I didn't, I'd never hear the end of it. Not from Rukia, but from her soft-hearted captain." Kurosaki smiled, one of the few genuine smiles he'd ever seen on the hybrid's face. It reminded him he was young, and it wasn't such a bad thing to be reminded of. "Good," Kurosaki said, "then if it's okay with you, I have some host business to take care of." The hybrid always said those words facetiously, but there was too much truth in it. Kairaku questioned, "Here?" If it was in Soul Society, it was more than curiosity, it was a sort of truce Kurosaki had laid down to be upfront. He could do whatever the hell he wanted, but he tried to at least pretend to ask permission first. Kurosaki said, "Not here." Kairaku nearly rolled his eyes, but the hybrid was being semi-serious. He looked up at the sky. "Up there." Both he and Grimjo looked at Kurosaki, baffled. The hybrid answered as if it was something mundane, or he were only casually announcing the weather. "I found Ryuse's conduits." Kairaku's eyes widened. "They're alive. I thought Orihime-san." The pained look softened Kurosaki's expression, but it didn't linger. He explained over his grief. "Apparently. Their souls are so weak, I can barely feel them, it's no wonder he turned to a living soul." He jabbed a thumb at the sky. "It seems the greatest concentration of Kujeki is midway between the top of the sky and the ground." "The top of the sky?" Kairaku asked. Kurosaki looked caught, as if he'd said something he hadn't intended to. He didn't answer his question, choosing instead to carry on. "I thought I might kill them." He looked up again, his tone still too calm and casual for the subject to be altogether normal. "It seems fair." It was less the threat and more the application of judgment. It was bizarre to see the hybrid flip so quickly from the young man looking forward to seeing a friend to the cold and powerful hybrid he'd seen obliterate Aizen and kill his mentor. It was a reminder that the person he was dealing with was dangerous. Even so far removed from the situation, Kairaku thought he might agree. "If I ask you not to?" It was a probing question, and both of them knew it. Kurosaki stared up at the sky, at something Kairaku couldn't see, and answered wistfully. "I don't know. It just seemed like something I should do." To Kairaku's surprise, Grimjo spoke, whatever existence that is. He looked at Kairaku evenly, from one conduit to another. "It ain't living. Nothing deserves that." Kairaku believed him, though he still had to question Kurosaki's motives. His own rancor seemed to have more empathy for the situation than Ichigo. "Do what you like, Kurosaki-san." The hybrid dropped his head to look at him, trying to judge if Kairaku meant what he said. It felt a bit unfair to have a window into his soul. He could feel Kurosaki's indecision, and that was enough to reassure him. If Kurosaki could doubt, that was proof enough that the hybrid was still open to change. XXX. Kurosaki Ichigo. Grimjo wasn't thrilled to be left behind, but on the off chance the Kujeki was strong enough to harm him, he wasn't going to risk it, especially with how strong Sunyata was. Curious, he tried to use La Sanger to get closer, but it didn't work. He was displaced to a part of the sky miles away. That was interesting, and he couldn't help but picture magnets. Probably a shitty analogy, but he wasn't getting any closer using La Sanger. Pulling on the Kujeki was strange to him. It came from nowhere, but responded to his desires all the same. It was no wonder Ryuse was so dangerous. For Kujeki to function, even in the realm of a different god, resolved to be careful with it. Using it seemed to mellow him out, but not in an entirely pleasant way. Not for others. Grimjo compared him to Ulquiorra, and that stuck with him. Instead of trying to aim for a place in the sky that didn't exist, Ichigo jumped directly below it, into the heart of the ruins of Sirite. If Zangetsu had known it wasn't simply Soul Society that held a concentration of Kujeki, but the sky above it, he might have woken faster. "At least you woke up at all," Zangetsu griped. Ichigo's lips twitched into a smile. "I'm not blaming you, I got some sleep out of it. That was the best sleep I had in years." "No shit, King, the dead usually sleep pretty damn well." Ichigo rolled his eyes. "So dramatic. Where do you think you get your flair?" It was a solid point. His Hallow was more creative than him. "You think too much." "Also true. You ain't supposed to agree." Ichigo's smile widened. "Want me to lie? Let's go get this over with. I don't like mercy killing." It wasn't the morality but rather the boredom of it that Zangetsu hated. It wasn't like he expected morals from a Hallow, but it was still odd to him that he felt so little about it. "You weren't bereft of pity or empathy, Ichigo. Sometimes it feels like it. You have a higher threshold than most, it doesn't mean you can't feel." Ichigo wasn't sure if he was reassured, but he saw no reason to procrastinate further. Closing his eyes, he focused on the gap in his senses. Sensing the Kujeki was always strange. He knew it was there, in the same way he knew if he looked, he could see his own hand. Even if it was numb, he could expect it to be there. It was a slippery feeling to sense the things that weren't there. He let the Kujeki swallow him, stepping from the ripple in reality into the sky. He was miles above the surface, yet there was no wind. Time felt still, silent and thick as a tomb. He sensed the shades, but he didn't see them, not until he took a step forward. Parts of his vision distorted, as if something was obstructing his view. He walked in a circle, and his brain filled in the gaps with shapes. His eyes widened, realizing how many there were. This wasn't a handful like with Miklin's shades, this was a group, he wasn't even certain how many. He'd wondered why Ryuze hadn't had conduits, but that was flat wrong, the Shinigami had taken many. They stood in a loose cluster, statues outside of time. He sensed nothing from these shades, their souls were stagnated to the point they barely existed at all. It was eerie, even with all that he'd seen. He reached for Zangetsu, drawing the sword from his back. Power arched along the edge of his sword, bolstered by La Sanger and Das Licht. His power flickered in waves of black and white, the gods always eager to stretch their limits, even to the point of pressuring his mind, his instincts. He didn't like it, but it made sense to Ichigo that they would, it was a constant push and pull of power. Loosing a Jitsuga Tensho, his attack split the air in a chaotic vortex of clashing energy, grinding those souls to Reishi between opposing powers. It was easy, enough so that as his power faded and returned to him, he felt no gratification. Killing a thing that was already dead never felt good, but he thought he might feel something. He drew on the Kujeki to leave that place, and was stopped short by the sudden oppressive energy in the air. It cut through the stagnation like a hot blade. Ichigo turned, recognizing the feeling, but it went so much deeper than he'd ever realized. Reishi split the air and solidified into something he never truly thought he'd see again. Towering skeletons with proportions not quite human grasped the edges of towering obsidian doors, far larger than the doors he remembered seeing in the past, yet it had been so long ago, his memory might have betrayed him. The gates of hell. He hadn't forgotten about hell, but so much had happened, he hadn't ever stopped to consider the role it might play. The gates were seemingly pulled open by those skeletal hands, but the confines were dark, not bright like he remembered. The ing drag of a vacuum tugged at the ends of his shahakusho, creating a disturbing breeze in the Kujeki around him. Things didn't happen as before at all. A skeletal hand emerged from the dark. It wrapped around the threshold and pulled itself into the light. The skeleton was massive, crouching to pass through the doorway. Its bones were pitch black, limbs unnaturally long and distorted, inhuman. It dropped its jaw and seemed to inhale, drawing in something Ichigo couldn't see, but sensed was there, much in the way of Das Licht the Kujeki before he became a host. This skeleton didn't feel like Reishi, it felt like the gods, but there was another presence there, something more like Miklin, Ryuze, or Adalas. The skeleton extended a hand to Ichigo, and he took a wary step back, hand still tied around Zangetsu's hilt. It uncurled its fingers to him, its skeletal grin looking oddly amused. It spoke in a deathly rattle, the rasp of a dying breath. Kurosaki Ichigo. Ichigo's grip on Zangetsu tightened, eyes narrowing. You know of me? I know you, the skeleton corrected. A chill raced up Ichigo's spine. He could handle nightmares, but this certainty in its voice unsettled him. How? The skeleton's jaw dropped, hissing laughter carried that on the manufactured breeze. We have met before. We haven't, Ichigo insisted. I'd remember. There was no way he'd forget a presence like this. If he had to give it a name, he'd say it felt like death. Mortals see the lie, a god sees the truth. Ichigo at his head, wondering if it meant only a host could see it. If it existed on a plane above what others could perceive, like Altiza, that would explain why no one knew of its existence. It let out a sound almost like a sigh. A shame your soul is beyond my reach. Ichigo had a feeling it didn't mean the fact that he was dead, but a host. He'd seen the way the gods hoarded and eroded souls firsthand, it was possibly the only escape from death he'd ever seen, and it was something to envy. Ichigo demanded. What do you want from me? It ignored him, or it seemed to, its head tilting a fraction to look behind him. The sins in these souls were heavy, and until now, beyond my reach. Thank you, Godling. Ichigo looked from the skeleton's hand to its empty sockets, not buying for an instant that it was here to merely thank him. He was missing something. He asked, who are you? Its expression couldn't change, but Ichigo got the distinct feeling of amusement as it breathed a name with a weight he'd never heard it spoken with before. Shinigami. Dread settled in his stomach, looking to the skeleton's outstretched hand again. Ichigo felt he'd made some kind of mistake. Yorishiku Onegaishimasu Kurosaki Ichigo. It began to laugh, a quiet distant sound that seemed to crawl from the back of his mind. From its fingertips outward it was blown away like ashes, drawn back into hell. The doors slammed shut, Reishi scattered away from the force of it. The seals on the skeletons on the doors burned away, the Kakara impaling them crumbling in on themselves like broken sandcastles, until those too were scattered on the wind. The doors vanished in a heap of ash, disappearing without a trace. Ichigo watched the last of the ashes swirl out of existence, turning a circle, sensing nothing but the Kujeki. Whatever hell was, it didn't exist in the same reality, it was gone. Fuck. He'd done something, probably something very bad, and he wasn't even sure what it was. Zangetsu's voice was deeply sarcastic. Good job, King. We don't even know what it is I actually did yet. Looks a lot like you freed the actual Shinigami. He could argue, but they knew that was probably the case. Well should. It was just one problem after another, he should just retire before he fucked up anything else. You did what? Grimjo stared at him in genuine disbelief. You think he'd be used to this by now? Ichigo couldn't even argue that Zangetsu was right. He shrugged. I may have accidentally undone a seal, or seals, on hell. You unsealed hell, Grimjo repeated. He let out a heavy breath and asked, what the fuck does that even mean? You know, Ichigo admitted. I don't know. Incredible, Grimjo mocked. You don't even know what genre of fucked we are. Look, Ichigo said, gesturing wider the more frustrated he became. I killed the shades, and the gates of hell showed up, and this thing that felt like a host shows up. Wait, another host. Grimjo was watching him with wide eyes, understandably stressed. Ichigo said slowly, yes. Grimjo didn't say anything to that, so Ichigo kept talking. It says it knows me, thanks me, and tells me he can't fucking wait to work with me. Then all the seals disintegrated and it all disappears into another fucking dimension. You left out all the laughing. The story doesn't need it. You tell stories like Kaneko. Thanks, Ichigo answered dryly. That's Grimjo settled on a word, ominous. So now what? I don't know, so we're going to go find hell. His Frachian squinted at him, confused, and Ichigo explained, I've already got a job escorting Shinigami back to Soul Society, all I have to do is tail them for a bit and eventually they'll run into someone rotten enough to involve hell. What are you gonna do? Grimjo mocked. Ask it. Something to that effect. If asking involved violence, then yes, he was going to ask away. Guess we'd better go pick up the runt, Grimjo said. Unsurprisingly, the two didn't get along. Ichigo was looking forward to working with Rukia again, but not her and Grimjo together. Ichigo stressed. No one else can know about this, not yet. You don't gotta ask me to cover your ass anymore, Kurosaki, I get it. XXX. Grimjo. Sitting smack in the center of a crowd of Shinigami was not how he wanted to spend his day. He didn't like being gawked at, not when he had to keep his hands to himself and just take it. Kurosaki was only a couple of feet away, disgustingly used to the staring. The hybrid was leaning forward on his knees, rolling a bit of grass between his fingers, that look in his eyes like he was focused on something distant. Kurosaki's voice was flat. Relax, they're harmless. Grimjo started bouncing his knee, scowling at the closest Shinigami. Aren't you some kind of demigod? Why do we have to fucking wait? Because I don't want to be an asshole. Kurosaki shot him a confused and chiding look. Yes, if I wanted to, I could just kidnap her and we could be on our way, but I'm not going to do that. Why the fuck not? Grimjo growled. You know why, stop pretending you don't. Hucker was right, he did know, but he didn't like it. He cast another look around, his eyes suspiciously higher than normal person height. Where's that spiky asshole? Kurosaki shot him a look. Kenpachi. No. No, and no again, we didn't come here for fun. He frowned at him and asked, getting tired of fighting me? Grimjo snorted. Don't get your panties in a bunch, if you fight me for keeps I'll be fucking dead. The hybrid sighed wistfully and muttered, don't remind me. Don't be such a girl, Grimjo said. Kurosaki said, hi Renji. Grimjo was confused until he turned around and saw the Redeed a few feet behind him. Renji smirked and said, ladies. Waiting for Rukia. The fuck do you think? Grimjo snapped, standing to face the Fukatecho, itching for a fight. Kurosaki stood with him, his hand on his shoulder, a silent reminder to chill out. The Shinigami here knew well enough he wouldn't do shit if Kurosaki was there, and in his opinion they took advantage of it. Renji frowned at Grimjo, and his eyes slid back to Kurosaki. She's going to be another couple of hours at least. Kairaku just talked to me, said maybe you'd want to keep busy while you wait, and he figures you can kill two birds with one stone. Kurosaki raised a brow. Okay, I'm listening. Gesturing around them, Renji said, I don't need to tell you people are scared of you, and you're about as sociable and approachable as a hornet. Frowning, Kurosaki said, keep the compliments coming. So what if, hear me out, what if you help train some of the unseated officers? Renji shrugged. Might get them to be less afraid of you now that you're Lasicno. Grimjo was pretty sure he was going to say crazy. Kurosaki supplied dryly, violent. Yeah, Renji agreed. Violent. Grimjo growled, well then what the fuck am I supposed to do? Same, if you feel like doing it. Renji said, and if you promise not to break anyone. His eyes slid to Kurosaki again, as if he was unsure if it was a good idea or not. Kurosaki said, I'll be there, it's fine. I don't need a babysitter, Grimjo growled. Kurosaki looked at him, his expression easier to discern now that he'd spent nearly all of his time around him. The hybrid looked nearly sympathetic. You do. The first time we were here you nearly broke someone's arm. He bumped into me, Grimjo argued. Still not a good reason, Kurosaki said. He looked at Renji and asked, did Kairaku say which squad? Well, you don't have a problem with 11th, they love you. 5th is off the table. Why? Grimjo interrupted. Kurosaki looked at him and answered tonelessly. That was Aizen's squad. Oh. Probably in bad taste, especially since there were still rumors kicking around that Kurosaki actually liked Aizen. Kurosaki's expression was carefully blank, but he felt his unease and a tale of emotions he couldn't name. Renji kept talking, likely sensing it too. The best squads after that would probably be the 13th, 3rd, 7th, or 6th. Kurosaki looked up in thought, then asked, which one likes me the least? Renji scratched his head, thoughtful. Maybe 3rd. Really? Kurosaki seemed surprised, and Grimjo just felt left out. Jin has a surprising amount of loyalty from his squad, and when he got punished because of you, twice, I think they took it personally. If we weren't pathetically short on captains, he might have been demoted or worse. Kurosaki said wistfully, you made a good captain in my time. Renji floundered for words, a blush on his face. Sometimes Grimjo forgot Kurosaki lived years with these people that none of them could remember. The feelings it dredged up were always bittersweet, with emphasis on the bitter. Grimjo didn't like it much. When Renji wasn't sure how to recover, Kurosaki had pity on him and pulled the conversation back. I kept wondering what happened to Jin. If they blame me I suppose I can't make it any worse. 3rd then? Renji asked. Sure, Kurosaki answered. He must have sensed Grimjo's confused scowl, because while they walked, Kurosaki fell back from Renji and explained, Jin gave me Aizen's Hajoku a while back and he never did oppose me as much as he should have. I guess Yamajai noticed. Grimjo frowned. He was on your side. I don't think so, but he didn't get in my way either, not until they tried to seal me. He read me better than most, he knew exactly how to get under my skin. That was strange, but Grimjo didn't question it and he couldn't without knowing more about this captain. Instead, he did his best to ignore the fearful and angry glares thrown their way. Ungrateful little shits. They got to a section that didn't seem any different from the rest of the camp, but apparently it counted as the 3rd division. Jin was just as privy to Kurosaki's soul as the rest of them, he stood there waiting, that stupid grin on his face. He smiled at Grimjo first. Ma, it's been a while, Haranker. I've got a name, Grimjo growled. Jin ignored that and looked to Kurosaki, his hands folded in his sleeves. What brings you to a humble division of the Gate 13? Grimjo wasn't sure, but it sounded a bit like he was deriding his own squad. Renji explained what Kairaku had in mind, and Jin's smile never faded. I only have one condition. Kurosaki waited, and Jin said, I want to spar with you first. Kurosaki had little issue with that, shrugging. Whatever you want, Jin. It was a few boring minutes of his Fukatecho gathering what members weren't out and about to go off outside of their little encampment to spar. Jin insisted on everyone staying very, very far back, and Kurosaki seemed to understand why. The members hanging around looked like they couldn't stand him or Kurosaki, and that was fine, but their demeanor was very different from the squads they'd dropped in on before. They were quiet, disciplined, and after being around other squads, it was a noticeable difference. Jin and Kurosaki stood just about 100 feet apart from each other, which seemed kind of far to spar. Without any perceptible warning, Jin spoke and released his sword, drawing it with a sharp glow of Ryatsu. Grimjo had no idea what it could do, but from the look on Kurosaki's face, he had a feeling the hybrid did. In a flash of light Grimjo could barely track, Jin's sword had covered a huge distance, and Kurosaki hadn't moved, except to block with one raised arm. Jin withdrew his sword with a sigh, and it was fast enough that Grimjo couldn't track it at all. The Taicho called over to Kurosaki, his tone full of reproach. At least pretend to try, Kurosaki-san. I wanted to gauge your speed, Kurosaki lowered his arm and answered, a small smile noticeable on his face, even at that distance. You're still fast. Flattery will get you nowhere, Kurosaki-san. Jin disappeared into Shunpo that was blindingly fast, Grimjo couldn't help but grind his teeth at that. Watching the pair clash, the Taicho's speed was enough to rival his Resurrection. Still not enough to challenge Kurosaki, but they all knew that walking into this. Kurosaki didn't need his Zanpakuto for this, not against a captain, and especially not one in Shikai, but that didn't seem to be why Jin had asked. Jin's sword was fast, as was he, but he couldn't cut Kurosaki, the latter only blocked out of respect. Jin too seemed to not be taking this seriously yet, not if he wouldn't use Bankai, and that only left Grimjo and his entire squad confused as to why. XXX. Kurosaki Ichigo. Jin was just as fast as he remembered, even in Shikai, and the feeling he got from his sword when his blade touched his wrist was confusing. The longer they fought, the more it became clear to him that Jin had no idea he could read his heart in his sword, because despite how hard it was to read him on the outside, his heart was in turmoil. Ichigo wasn't so sure it was any of his business. Ichigo grabbed his sword before he could reach his throat and said, "Why wouldn't you show me your Bankai?" It wasn't even a contest outside of Bankai, and they both knew that. He felt regret and anger, so much anger. Jin retracted his sword and said it was meant for him. Given the nature of his Bankai and the depth of his hatred for the man, Ichigo could only assume what Jin meant. Ichigo thought he might refuse by the virtue of it, but he went into Bankai anyway. Bankai. Chorus, Kamishini no Yari. His sword brightened with an influx of Reishi, and this time when he attacked, it was fast, very fast. The distance his sword could stretch didn't matter, they both knew that, and he couldn't attack at a distance without killing a bystander, so Jin's attacks were direct and efficient, hardly bothering with a swing at all. It was almost nostalgic to be fighting him again. The last time he'd lost miserably. Now that he was in Bankai, Jin's entire demeanor changed. Jin couldn't hurt him, he just wasn't strong enough, but to feel his intent to kill burn so strongly in his attacks only raised questions. He knew the Taicho's squad noticed, but no one was going to stop them. Ichigo moved in close, giving Jin more of an advantage, and started to actually fight back. He knocked Jin's sword out of the way with his hand and was surprised to sense both doubt and fear. He twitched out of the way of his sword, punching and kicking at a speed he hoped Jin could dodge, and thankfully, it wasn't too fast for the Taicho. Ichigo was starting to get tired of being out of the loop, uncertain what it was that was triggering this reaction, but he wanted to know. Ichigo caught Jin's sword mid-jab, twisting his arm around behind his back with his sword angled towards the ground. Jin didn't fight his hold, calmly aware he wasn't going anywhere until Ichigo let him. Ichigo asked, "Why are you so angry?" They were far enough away that their conversation would stay private, so Ichigo could only hope Jin would talk. The Taicho glanced back over his shoulder at him, his outward appearance no different than usual. "Creepy, Kurosaki-san. Not even Aizen could read me like that." Ichigo let go of his sword and took a step back. "I'm cheating. Your Zanpakuto is a part of your soul, I can sense that when I touch your sword." Jin chuckled. "Now that doesn't seem fair." Ichigo raised a brow. "You can sense my soul whenever you like, seems fair enough." Ichigo dropped his head in thought, and he noticed Jin tense, and he realized the Taicho really was afraid of him. "Are you going to answer, or keep trying to kill me?" Jin smirked, but there was no humor in it. He held up his hands in defeat, but he still held his sword tight enough that his guard wasn't down. "You've caught me, Kurosaki-san. I can't manage it, but I suppose I thought I might try." Ichigo spent a lot of his time with people trying to kill him, he wasn't offended, but he wanted to know the reason. "Why? Wonderin' if I haven't made a mistake. Don't get me wrong, kid, you seem alright, but you are just a kid, and I see a lot of him in you." Aizen. Ichigo realized he should have expected that, especially after what the Taicho said to him when Soul Society attempted to seal him. It didn't hit him as hard as it likely should have, especially with the Kujeki within arm's reach mellowing him out. "I see. It took Aizen years and years to get to where you were when you were a teen. I don't think he anticipated just how strong you would become." Ichigo couldn't say he disagreed about power, but it didn't feel entirely accurate. He argued, "I don't use people. Just because you aren't as good at it as he was, don't mean you aren't doing it, kid." Ichigo frowned, and he wasn't sure how to argue that. Jin said, "You know, I was there." Ichigo's brows fell, unsure what he meant. "I knew what Aizen was going to do with that hollow, white." Ichigo felt his blood run cold, his reaction strong enough that Jin shifted, defensive. Renji must have felt it too, because he heard him shout his name, but since he didn't interfere, he could only assume Grimjo held him back. Ichigo swallowed and closed his eyes for a long moment, flattening his knee-jerk propensity towards violence. "Easy, king. The past is past." His Hallow was right, but he couldn't stop the searing path of what-ifs from raising a trail through his memories. Ichigo was glad that no one could really see or feel the Kujeki. Drawing on it for help went by unnoticed by even the sharpest instincts. Calm wrapped around his emotions, dampening them like a drug. That wasn't good to rely on, he knew he needed to feel, but could he make exceptions? Slippery slope, king. Ichigo knew that, but it was so easy to take shortcuts. He opened his eyes, emotion steady, and said, "Doesn't change anything. Doesn't it?" Ichigo asked, "So what is it?" "Regret that you didn't interfere and stop me from existing at all." Jin chuckled. "Maybe, kid. Maybe." Ichigo couldn't blame him, his regrets had rewritten just about everything, he couldn't judge the Taicho without making himself a massive hypocrite. "You know," Jin said. He looked from his sword to Ichigo. "I was really trying to kill ya, and it barely ruffled your feathers. Not sure if that's scary or sad." Ichigo scoffed. What's wrong with both? I'm used to people trying to kill me. If I took it personally there'd be no one left. He gave Jin a once-over, wishing he knew what he was feeling, but he knew what Jin meant by unfair. Nearly godlike power coupled with the knowledge of his heart. Dangerous. Careful not to move too quickly, Ichigo reached for Zangetsu, drawing it to stab it into the ground. Drawing the trench knife, he did the same, tossing it into the ground. I'm trying, I am. I can't help how much power I have but I'm trying, Jin. Jin watched him warily, but didn't move, answering, doesn't seem fair. It sounded like the Taicho was talking generally. I don't think I'm over it, Ichigo admitted. He glanced over at Grimjo, pointedly and said, look, you probably know how it is, I'm used to fighting a rancor. They put their pride and their dignity into damn near every fight, there's no such thing as sparring. If they can still stand by the end of it, you haven't won. So what do you want from me? You can't kill me, I'm not going to let you, and your squad hates me. What do we do about that? Jin laughed again, and this time it sounded more genuine. You're a strange kid, Kurosaki-san, but I can't say I don't like you. He widened his stance, shifting to be on the offensive. Ichigo wasn't sure if he'd ever actually heard the Taicho be serious in his life, Jin's tone was both serious and teasing. Let's see if I can't at least nick your Shihakusho. XXX. Grimjo. When it became clear the Redeed wasn't going to interfere, Grimjo loosened his grip in his shoulder and returned his hands to his pockets. Renji asked, how did you know Ichigo wouldn't hurt him? I didn't, Grimjo answered. What? Grimjo scowled at the Redeed. Aren't you supposed to be friends? Have some faith in him. Shooting him a sidelong glance, Renji said, that felt a hell of a lot like he wanted to kill something. Mainly, Jin. The Fukatecho was wondering if he'd overreacted, and that was fine. Grimjo leaned back against the tree and tried not to growl. He sensed a few of the officers around him staring, listening, and it was irritating, but he didn't censor his answer because of it. He's back down from worse. Kurosaki is violent, he likes to fight, but he doesn't like to indulge his impulses. The Shinigami Grimjo couldn't see said, what's the difference? Real irritation surged in Grimjo's veins, leaning forward to face them, but Renji stepped between them with a warning pleading look. God damn it. What's the difference, Grimjo mocked. He ran his hand through his hair and gestured at the pair. If he was acting on his impulses, your captain would be dead. Grimjo was met with more than skepticism, he was met with hatred and denial. Grimjo ground his teeth and snarled, you think he disarmed himself as an insult, don't you? Fucking look, can't you see it? Their eyes flickered back to the fight, and Grimjo dared them to deny reality. Kurosaki was fighting as close to keeps as he could manage, he had more respect for the Gate 13 than Grimjo thought he should have. Kurosaki was worried he'd slip, his own paranoia over saving these people was only making things worse. That sparked a thought. Grimjo said, stick around and watch him fight me. Aren't you his Fukatecho? A blonde Shinigami asked. Grimjo noted the armband, realizing this was Jin's Fukatecho. Quiet fucker, he made a note to watch out for him. He answered, something like that. He looks like an rancor, you think he's some kind of monster, I get it, but he ain't what you think. He treats you like Shinigami. The blonde said, we're not fragile. I'm saying you're different, Grimjo snapped. Some of these Shinigami were strong, and some were downright insane, but they weren't a rancor. Shinigami could be brutal, but they lacked the savage instincts they considered to be beneath them. Grimjo watched Kurosaki's hands flex with a desire to rend, but he didn't indulge that desire. Idiots, all of them, they couldn't see what was right in front of their faces. Renji ventured, Grimjo. Grimjo gave up on the rest and dropped his voice, so only Renji was privy to what he said. You see it, don't you? Renji asked, see what? Grimjo stifled a sigh of frustration. How careful he is. You of all people should understand. You can feel how strong he is, now look, Dumbus. He felt Renji's eyes move away, focusing on Kurosaki. Jin was fast, but Kurosaki moved like lightning, casually deflecting his blows to hit him with what might have been a love tap. Can you imagine holding back that much? Raising his voice, Grimjo continued, you should all be fucking flattered he gives enough of a shit to hold back and still show you some respect. He beat the shit out of your best captains when he was 16. Grimjo snarled. Renji shot him a look, you could try not to be so confrontational. Grimjo watched Kurosaki fight and growled, I hate this place. Once, the gap between him and Kurosaki had enraged him, but he'd accepted it. There were other, more realistic goals. He could try, but beating himself up over not being able to match a god was stupid. He saw how much of a cost it brought down on Kurosaki, he didn't want that. Jin's fight only lasted as long as Kurosaki managed to let him keep his sword. Ichigo disarmed him, wincing. He hadn't meant to do that was clear, but he hadn't broken Jin's Zanpakuto. The captain smirked, retrieving his sword and called over to the hybrid. I wish I'd seen you before your prime, Kurosaki-san. You beat me once. Badly, Kurosaki admitted. But I. Kurosaki nodded, adding redundantly. I got better. No shit. The hybrid retrieved his swords, and the two walked back over, most of the tension between them dissolved, which was actually rather impressive. The squat-eyed Kurosaki and Jin's Fukatecho spoke up before anyone else could talk. I'd like to see Kurosaki-san fight their ranker. Kurosaki corrected absently. Grimjo. His brows furrowed when he registered the request. Why? The Fukatecho's brows drew together and he looked at Jin for permission. Jin shrugged and said, it's up to Kurosaki-san, I won't stop him. A few more Shinigami stepped forward, voicing their interest, and Kurosaki looked to Grimjo in confusion, asking, the fuck did you tell them? Grimjo owned up to it, baring his teeth. That they don't know the first thing about you. Kurosaki looked surprised, then concerned, his eyes flicking over to Renji. I'm not sure if. Trust me, Grimjo growled. Those words caught Kurosaki off guard, watching Grimjo with those burning wider eyes. His expression betrayed very little, but Grimjo knew him better than he should, and even without that connection to his soul, he could see that he'd won. Kurosaki finally blinked, grimacing and said, Finiake. He gestured at the field, just about untouched after his short spar with Jin. A tree was leveled, but it was about the same. Go. Far, far out. They walked out, further than he had with Jin. The wind was gentle, tugging the grass in rippling waves. It was real fucking peaceful, Grimjo couldn't wait to ruin it. Grimjo faced Kurosaki like he had just about every day for years. It was still a relatively short amount of time, but long enough for it to be routine and feel familiar. These fights never ended well for him, not from an objective standpoint, but fuck if it didn't feel good to push his limits. The only thing new about this scenario was that they had an audience, and he'd have to actually hold back for once. Kurosaki eyed their audience warily, and Grimjo snapped, what are you looking at them for, you're fighting me. Kurosaki's eyes flicked back to Grimjo, narrowed thoughtfully. The hybrid knew Grimjo was doing this for a reason, but he wasn't sure what it was. Fine, let him wonder. Kurosaki reached for the knife at his waist and laid down some rules. No zeros, no disgaren. Understand? Grimjo curled his lips back from his teeth and hissed, fine, whatever. He could work with that. He drew Pantera, angling his sword before him and rested his fingers on the blade. He slashed along the edge and snarled, grind, Pantera. He skipped directly into his Segunda Etapa, Reiatsu surging around him in a vicious wave, only to sink back into his skin like armor. He crouched, dark claws digging into loamy earth. There was no sand, no moon, and it was strange to be facing Kurosaki in the light of day, but not so strange that he didn't feel a savage smile pull at his lips. Kurosaki idly twirled his sword in his hand and did him the courtesy of just about forgetting everything around him. He saw the shift in Kurosaki's shoulders, the loosening of his spine, and the savage widening of his eyes. Kurosaki might not understand his request, but he trusted him. Once he would have called him a fool for that, but now Grimjo understood the benefits of trust. Kurosaki wasn't going to censor this fight, and that was all Grimjo could have asked for. Grimjo moved first, claws out, and crossed the distance in a heartbeat, slashing at Kurosaki's throat. His claws passed through Kurosaki's after image, but that wasn't a shock. Grimjo spun mid-air, kicking where he hoped Kurosaki would be. His shin connected with Kurosaki's arm, the force behind it splitting the ground beneath him. Grimjo let out a bark of triumphant laughter, his tail lashing around the hybrid's throat. Kurosaki led him, getting a grip on his tail and flinging him into the ground hard enough for it to crater. Grimjo was ready for it, he tensed his muscles before he hit the ground, so he didn't get the air knocked out of him like Kurosaki hoped. Grimjo was up on his feet before Kurosaki could impale him with his claws, swiping at his face. To Grimjo's surprise, Kurosaki didn't duck, he twisted his head and used his horns as a defense, stopping Grimjo's hand short on the edge. It looked like he was finally getting used to having them, and it made it far more interesting. Kurosaki disappeared, and Grimjo flung his arm out where he hoped he would be, hoping to hit him with a Gara. He turned in time to see that he had, and Kurosaki rewarded that by not stabbing him in the shoulder. The hybrid Sanpakuto cut along his ribs, but that wasn't the attack Grimjo was worried about. Kurosaki jerked his head to the side, the sharp edge of a horn cutting into Grimjo's chest, before he could get completely out of the way. Well, that fucking hurt. Kurosaki spun and threw his sword at him, the bastard. Grimjo twisted out of the way, but his blade still cut deep into his shoulder. The hybrid raised a hand and called his sword back to his palm, the blade spiraling back to him fast enough to cut Grimjo's lower leg on the way. Grimjo snarled and flung his arm out, throwing 4 Garas in his direction. Kurosaki threw his arm out, a wave of Reiatsu destroying them before they could make contact. Kurosaki tilted his head and chided, you know those will fuck up the whole mountain if they hit. Grimjo argued, didn't say I couldn't use M. The hybrid shrugged a shoulder. To be honest, I forgot about them. To be fair, there wasn't a snowball's chance in hell of hitting the hybrid with them, so Grimjo had stopped trying, but that didn't mean that wasn't annoying. "Fuck you too," Grimjo snarled, kicking off the ground into as fast of an assault as he could manage. He knew how Kurosaki fought, it wasn't too difficult to predict him, and his instincts unwittingly used his soul as a benchmark. The hybrid couldn't hide or surprise him anymore. Each attack Kurosaki struck or blocked sent a wave of power to disturb the ground at their feet. It was a bit different to fight on solid ground, hell, it was easier, and Grimjo found he was faster. He surprised Kurosaki with a bite to his forearm, and Kurosaki showed just how much he liked that by hammering him into the ground with the same arm. That winded him, but Kurosaki didn't let him catch his breath. Grimjo snarled when he felt Kurosaki's claws around his throat. "No, fuck that." Grimjo reached around to his side, drawing it away with his own blood. Grimjo gathered power in his palm, charging a Grand Race Zero. Kurosaki looked both annoyed and amused. "Going to hurt you more than it hurts me." Grimjo just laughed and fired it directly into Kurosaki's face. XXX. Renji. He'd fought Hallows for years, he thought he knew what to expect from a spar between Ichigo and an Ranker, but he was wrong. It was blindingly fast and violent enough that he wasn't sure he could tell if it was sparring or not. The two looked like they couldn't wait to kill each other. Watching Ichigo fight Jin was like a demonstration in skill, but watching Ichigo fight Grimjo wasn't anything like he expected. He would have thought they were actually trying to kill either other if not for the laughter and the flash of a smile. Ichigo had an overwhelming advantage of speed and power over Grimjo, but the Ranker didn't seem to care. Ichigo's sword dug into Grimjo's chest, splattering his blood on the ground. They didn't stop, Grimjo kept going, ignoring his injuries as if this weren't just sparring. The blue Zero Grimjo gathered in his palm surprised Renji, it was massively powerful, the Reishi in the air was displaced from its mere existence. He took a sharp step back, but it seemed Ichigo was prepared for it. Before Grimjo could use it, a sphere of dark encompassed them both, and when it faded away, Ichigo looked ruffled but untouched, and Grimjo was a bloody mess. Ichigo straightened, still holding him by the throat, and when he dropped the Ranker he staggered, then fell to a crouch. Ichigo said, "What did I say about Zero? Since when do I fucking do what you say?" Grimjo countered. He spat out a mouthful of blood and complained, "You didn't have to guard me from it." Ichigo scoffed, "Some of it. If I thought you could take all of it and keep going, well." Renji thought they were done until Ichigo asked, "You good?" Grimjo coughed up blood, smearing it over his forearm, then chuckled. "What do you think?" The Ranker moved, faster than Renji thought he had any business moving, especially with injuries like that. His attacks on Ichigo were opportunistic and brutal, if he was attacking anyone but the hybrid, they would be mincemeat. Renji knew the Ranker was strong, but maybe seeing him next to the hybrid so often had skewed his perspective. Grimjo was very strong. He understood now what Grimjo said when he told them Ichigo was holding back. There was less care in the way Ichigo moved now, he wasn't afraid he was going to kill Grimjo when they fought. Renji realized both of them were reacting out of habit, then attempting to work around those habits. They fought each other often enough that this was an old familiar dance, and from the smiles on their faces, an enjoyable one. Grimjo was powerful, and if they did this all the time, he was only going to get stronger. Despite the attacks Grimjo landed, none of them hurt Ichigo, and Renji noticed the hybrid was rewarding clever or skillful moves and punishing bad ones. His eyes widened when he realized they weren't sparring or fighting, this was playing. 7 hells, this was just a painful and bloody game of tag. Jin stepped up beside him, hands in his sleeves and sighed. "I knew he was going easy on me, but it's a bit embarrassing, ain't it? Now I see why Blue wanted us to see this." Renji tore his eyes away to look at him when Jin chuckled. "He might be a scary bastard, but it's hard to hate someone having so much fun. Don't think I've ever seen him smile before." Renji looked back and realized Jin was right. Grimjo might have been on the brink of spitting out some teeth, but they were both having fun, and he didn't think anyone here had ever seen that. Renji finally understood the point of it. Grimjo didn't want them to see some godlike all-powerful monster, he wanted them to see the person behind all that. Ironic that the thing about Ichigo that scared people the most was also the thing that was undoing all that fear. If he didn't think too hard about how sad that was, it was an impressive fight. He'd seen the ugly side of Ichigo's power and the skillful side when he fought Kenpachi or anyone else, but he'd never seen him open up enough to enjoy himself. If this is what he was normally like, Renji could see why Grimjo was so angry at them all. Renji couldn't blame the hybrid for being so distant, he would be too if he had to face the people that shared parts of his soul. As it was, Renji could feel Ichigo's elation, this feeling dominated all the rest of his usual anxieties, and now that he knew the cause, it explained what the fuck Ichigo was up to when Renji had felt this in the past. What was someone like Ichigo supposed to do for fun anyways? Watching the hybrid smother Zero with nothing but his bare hand and an ecstatic laugh, Renji realized it fit. It was a game, one that Grimjo benefited from. The Arankor tried his damnedest to kill him, and Ichigo foiled his attempts with as little wasted energy as possible. His eyes widened. "Oh, I get it. Restraint." Jin laughed. "Took you long enough to notice." Renji was startled by Rukia's voice behind him. "What's this about restraint?" He looked back and realized the crowd of onlookers had grown to extend to more than one division. With all the damage the pair was causing, Renji half expected Kairaku to show up and break it up. Then again, Kairaku was privy to everything Ichigo felt, and joy was a pretty good indicator that nothing was wrong. Renji folded his arms and turned back to watch. "I didn't notice Ichigo was playing this game with rules." Rukia watched for a moment, then questioned, "Rules?" Gin said, "He was holding back a lot more with me. He's testing his strength against blue here. First time he grabbed Grimjo's arm, his armor cracked. Second time it didn't. For someone with as much strength as Ichigo, a difference that minute and subtle would be incredibly difficult to manage. If this is how Ichigo treated his closest friend, then they really should feel special." Gin called out to his squad. "I hope you're taking notes. They really should be." Grimjo was above captain class, and Ichigo was something else. Grimjo was starting to get tired, and Ichigo hadn't even broken a sweat, a wide grin on his face when he dodged a slash, only to appear directly behind the Arankor. Ichigo gave Grimjo a shove instead of drawing blood, having a bit of mercy on him, now that he was tiring out. Grimjo didn't appreciate it, whirling with a swear. Ichigo took a step to the side, and then was seemingly in 3 places at once. Grimjo growled loudly, aggravated. "Asshole." Ichigo laughed and he was suddenly in 5 places, hair whipping around his face at the speed. His after-image was eerily mid-motion, the force of Reiatsu no one could even sense displacing dust and Reishi in his wake. Grimjo turned a sharp circle, debating what to do. Rukia whined, "He's not even in Bankai, how is he so fast?" The hybrid was suddenly in 7 places, and Grimjo snarled, "Stop going easy on me." The duplicates all shrugged helplessly. "You're taking an awful long time to decide." He split into 9. "I thought I'd make it easier." Gira questioned, "He's slowing down." "Why?" Gin said, "All part of the game." It seemed to be. Grimjo reacted as if this was par the course. Ichigo's smile turned a bit mischievous, his laughter echoing around Grimjo, playful, but not mocking. Grimjo threw his arms out, claws glowing with blue Reiatsu, and slashed outwards at all of his after-images at once. Ichigo's image blurred, and those blue swaths of solidified Reiatsu were shattered. He chided, "What did I say about Discairn?" "Worth a try," Grimjo snarled. In a motion Renji didn't quite follow, Grimjo moved, and both disappeared in the buzz of Sonido. They reappeared some distance away, then disappeared again. Renji flinched, startled when Ichigo threw Grimjo bodily down into the ground. It split underneath the sheer force, dust and Reishi settling around the pair in a cloud. The hybrid stood over him, hair wild from the sheer speed he'd been moving at, and smiled. "I win." Grimjo coughed, struggling for air, and didn't get up, but that didn't stop him from talking shit. "I lost." His tone was thinly veiled sarcasm. "That's so weird. I thought I had a shot." His transformation fell away, power once again condensed into a sword. Ichigo sheathed his own sword and held out a hand down to him. Grimjo clasped his forearm, and Ichigo practically lifted Grimjo's weight on his own. Grimjo complained, "Ow." Ichigo set him on his feet, and the Arankor started to laugh, the sound strained. "You still hit like a fucking mountain, Kurosaki, I think you got a couple ribs that time." Rukia, fearless, strode up to the pair now that they seemed like they were done. She called out, "I thought you were waiting for me. He's a wreck, now I'm waiting on you." Grimjo let out a bark of laughter. "Ha. False, Beansprout." He winced and lifted his hand to his side, but his grin didn't fade. Ichigo rolled his eyes, an expression that still seemed out of place on someone inherently intimidating. "Now that he knows I can fix him, he gets carried away." Carried away getting beat to hell. She pinned Grimjo with a pitying look. "You're insane." Ichigo reached for Grimjo's mask, and he must have been comfortable enough with Ichigo in his personal space, because he kept talking, his smile too wide. "Maybe let's see you fight him next, shorty." Rukia grit her teeth and snapped, "You don't hear me talking shit about your stupid hair." Grimjo laughed. "PFF, that's all you've got. Can you shut the fuck up for 2 seconds, Ichigo growled. He got a grip on Grimjo's mask and yanked him closer, purposefully pulling him off balance, but the Arankor didn't complain. Darkness swarmed over Grimjo's skin like ink, and when it dripped away, evaporating into Reishi, he looked completely untouched. Grimjo still looked tired, but physically, he was just about perfect. Ichigo let Grimjo go and huffed. "Fixed. Be free." Ichigo and Rukia started walking back to the others, and Grimjo followed, rolling his arm and stretching out apparently stiff muscles. Renji groaned, "How the fuck is that fair?" Ichigo said, it's complicated, I'll only risk doing it on a conduit. So you could fix me? Renji asked. Rukia snickered, no one can fix you, Renji. Renji blushed and muttered, you know what I mean. Ichigo said, in theory but I'm better with Altiza, I wouldn't do it if I didn't have to. The squads that had gathered to watch were breaking up, talking amongst themselves, but they were a far less rowdy crowd than the 11th. A Shinigami said something about cheating, and Grimjo must have had good hearing, because he didn't let it slide. Oi. What was that? Yeah, I see you, motherfucker. Ichigo raised his voice, impressively louder and more authoritative than Grimjo. Shut up, Grimjo. To Renji's surprise, Grimjo did. Ichigo turned on the Shinigami. And you. Jealous. If you want, we can go around. I can beat the shit out of you, break a few bones, Anohana can heal you. His smile turned absolutely vicious and the Shinigami paled under the attention. And we can do that every day. Rukia slapped Ichigo's arm and snapped, and you wonder why they don't like you. Ichigo's expression fell into one of pure annoyance, dissolving any tension before it could take root. Renji realized Rukia was good at that. Gin said carelessly. Can you not threaten my squad, Kurosaki-san? Ichigo's tone was unapologetic. Sorry. Neither of them were serious, and for once, that was fine. Renji felt a shift in both Ichigo and the squads watching him. They weren't on edge because Ichigo wasn't, they weren't looking at him like he was going to kill something. Ichigo was relaxed for once, less anxious, and it was infectious. Seeing him act normal dragged him down in a good way. It was a reminder that he was mortal too. Even Grimjo looked happy, but then, he'd gotten what he'd wanted. Renji was starting to see the parts of Ichigo that Rukia cared about. He hadn't understood until recently why she had been so attached. The hybrid shut himself off from others, but he was trying. Renji said, well, this was enlightening. Now that you have a new babysitter, I'm off. Rukia gave him a half salute and a smile that was so unburdened by worry, it made his chest ache at the sheer nostalgia of it. See you soon, Renji. XXX. Kurosaki Ichigo. Ichigo was in a good mood, a startlingly good mood, given he was still processing what he may or may not have done regarding Hell. In spite of his good mood, once the three of them were safe in living world, Rukia turned directly to him and demanded, what did you do? Ichigo feigned offense, and Grimjo left him to flounder. Asshole. What makes you say that? She folded her arms like it was obvious. Guilt, Dumbus. If guilt had a smell. It does, Grimjo supplied. Then, if I could smell guilt I wouldn't need to feel your soul to know you either think you did something, or you did, you big idiot. She raised a brow. So which is it? Ichigo struggled with an answer, and Grimjo muttered, the shrimp was gonna find out eventually. Ichigo shot Grimjo a glare and folded his arms defensively. After a second suffering a deeply withering look, he started from the beginning of his short little story, and it ended with Rukia looking less worried than he thought she'd be. What? Rukia said, after all the shit that's happened, what's one more thing? You'll handle it, I trust you. Grimjo stared at her with just as much, if not more shock, than Ichigo. Ichigo protested. What did I do to deserve that? She smiled and gave him a chiding look. Ichigo. When you put your mind to something, you do it. I still haven't forgotten that you saved my life and saved the world. Ichigo grimaced. You don't have to word it like that. Seriously, Grimjo growled, don't. What if he gets an ego? Like you can talk, Ichigo bit back. Rukia said, well it's too late for that, people are already calling you the God Eater. Ichigo squinted at her. What? Who the fuck started that? Rukia blew out her cheeks and shrugged, looking as innocent as possible. I have no idea, asked Renji. Grimjo nodded sagely. That ain't bad. What, don't agree with her? Ichigo protested. Rukia hastily changed the subject, slapping her fist down into her palm. So what's the plan? Ichigo growled, and you blame me for my people problems. Rukia said, you could smile more in it like that. Ichigo wouldn't call his expression a smile either. Okay, the plan. What plan? Grimjo asked. The plan I'm making up right now, Ichigo snarled. So we find the Shinigami, and we spy on them for a bit. A bit, Rukia said. An hour. A few minutes. I don't know. Ichigo shrugged dramatically. As long as my patience can take it. Grimjo supplied, 30 minutes. Tops. Thank you, Grimjo. Ichigo said. So we spy on them, Rukia trailed off, and then what? Then we say hi, Ichigo said. Rukia frowned. No, not we. Me. Agreed, Grimjo said. The Aranker shoved his hands in his pockets and frowned. The less they see tall, dark and scary, the better. Ichigo tried not to whine, but he felt like he was whining. I'm not that scary. You are. Rukia and Grimjo answered in unison, and it appeared to annoy them both. Grimjo added, I made people nervous. You make people piss their pants scared. Ichigo grumbled, I get it already. Rukia was still staring at Grimjo. Your hair is very exciting, I don't blame them. Grimjo shot her a confused look. What? Rukia slapped her hands together. Yashi. Who's our first victim? Don't call them that, Ichigo growled, you'll scare them off, you weirdo. If Rukia was this excited, then whatever she was up to in Soul Society must have been really, really dull. Ichigo jerked his thumb east. First guy is somewhere that way. And she already left. Rukia looked back. Well. Come on, we already wasted enough time with you two flirting. Flirting, Grimjo repeated, outraged. We were waiting on you. Rukia was brutal, Grimjo couldn't even deny it without sounding like he was overcompensating, and from the look on his face, he was aware of it. Ichigo caught up with Rukia rather than be left behind. He said, when you explain Sarate is literally gone, try not to augment it with a slideshow. No response. Fascinating. Ichigo could practically feel the distaste radiating off of Grimjo when he asked, how many of these fuckers are there again? Ichigo closed his eyes, trying to pinpoint what his senses were telling him, and settled on his estimate. A lot. Fucking great, Grimjo snarled. Rukia's mood wasn't dampened at all, it was kind of nice to have more than a snarling wildcat for company. So he unsealed Hell.At the very least Ichigo could say he wasn't going to be bored. The trio were perched on a rooftop right outside the blocky waves of downtown skyscrapers. Some business district with cracked pavement and old telephone poles, their wires bunched up like a rat's nest. The Shinigami the trio were stalking had already consoed 3 souls, of which Ichigo had watched very carefully. The souls had nowhere to go, and thus were trapped in transition, something he thought he might be able to manually force, but he didn't want to accidentally destroy the soul, so Ichigo let them be. Grace was not his middle name. After a couple of hours, the Shinigami they were tailing finally ran into a hollow, and after watching this guy just walk around and talk for hours, Ichigo was grateful and ready for some excitement. Although, calling what they witnessed a fight would have been generous. The Shinigami moved like fresh blood, not comfortable with a sword, and wielding it more like a baseball bat than a weapon. Frankly, it was embarrassing, and from the faint blush dusting Rukia's cheeks, she was angry enough about this Shinigami's performance to concur. Grimjo drawled, I ain't a nice guy. Rukia snorted. But watching this guy struggle makes me feel like some sort of sadist. Ichigo looked at him, arms folded from where he was leaning. You're not. He looked back down over the edge of the building. Oh. The fuck, Kurosaki. If anyone's a sadist, it's you. Zangetsu absently offered up a correction. Masochist. I didn't ask your opinion. Like that's going to stop me. Ichigo pretended to think about it. You're right, you're just violent. He watched the Shinigami clumsily dodge a sideswipe and corrected, I'm selectively sadistic. Weighing his answer, Grimjo nodded and said, that's fair. Shouldn't we help him? Rukia asked. She was standing on the edge of the building, too short for a view over the railing without a perch, something Grimjo had spent the better part of the day mocking her for. Judging from her tone, she was just about done with the second-hand cringe. Nah, Ichigo said. He won't learn if he doesn't struggle a little. The Shinigami got hit with a tail, skidding 100 yards across a parking lot into a pole. The guy got up without too much of a hassle, and Ichigo gestured like this was proof and said, see? He's sturdy. Grimjo watched the Shinigami with a look that managed to be both bored and disgust and said, if all Shinigami are this pathetic, then you really are nothing but glorified janitors. Rukia's head whipped back and she snapped, what was that? By that logic hollows are just oversized rats. Grimjo didn't let it get to him, smirking. Then Shinigami are janitors and vultures. Ichigo's heart wasn't fully in it when he chastised them. Both of you shut up, he's going to notice us. Thy name was not Stealth, especially when they were bored. Good, Grimjo said, this is dull. You think anything that doesn't start with your sword in your hand is dull? Ichigo pointed out. Lewd, Rukia said. Ichigo rolled his eyes. I was being literal. Grimjo barked, ha. I don't even have a sword in Resurrection. Start with, Ichigo said. Rukia scoffed and shrugged. If it still ends with you on your back, I don't see the difference. Ichigo's eyes snapped to Grimjo in curiosity, but his response was predictable. Fuck you, Grimjo drawled lazily. She wasn't really wrong, so the Espada changed the subject. So what are the odds we run across hell anyways? Rukia and Ichigo shared a look, and Ichigo admitted, I've only seen the gates of hell once. His eyes flicked to Rukia. And I was with her. Rukia frowned and said, that was the first time I'd seen them as well. Grimjo stared at them in outraged disbelief, then recovered into his usual distemper. You can't be serious. So we go through all this, and it might be a massive waste of time. Ichigo watched the Shinigami fighting down below them backpedal into a parked car. He thanked their lucky stars the alarm didn't go off. He said, you know what, Rukia, save this guy. He might be more inclined to trust us after that. Gladly, she said. She straightened and blurred into Shunpo. What about me? Grimjo asked. Ichigo rolled his head over to look at him and replied, "What about you?" The Espada seethed in annoyance and grumbled, "My potential is wasted." Grimjo wasn't far off the mark and Ichigo had some mercy on him. "Patience, Grimjo. These Shinigami haven't ever seen an Arancor before and Rukia looks friendly." The Espada decided that was a compliment. Ichigo watched Rukia dispatch the Hallow with casual ease, watching the Hallow dissipate into Reishi. He felt it sink back into the primordial energy he was inextricably tied to in the same way he might feel the wind tease his hair. It was there, but distant and unthreatening, so it was easy to ignore. Instead of seeping between the spaces between worlds, it gathered, just one more soul saturating the air. It was merely a reminder that repairing that instability was important and necessary. One thing at a time. Rukia approached the tired Shinigami with the friendly ease of a coworker, sheathing her sword as she did. Ichigo wasn't sure what was said, but it looked like he recognized her, and he had no reason to fear another Shinigami, so he sheathed his sword, immediately relaxed. She gestured, small conservative motions, then broadly, telling what looked to be a very animated story. Rukia gestured in his direction, and the Shinigami nodded, arms crossed in contemplation. Rukia turned and made eye contact with Ichigo, raising her hand in a small wave. He knew he wasn't visible from that distance, not in the shadows, so his position was compromised, but not his appearance. The eye contact were merely proof that Rukia knew just how to take advantage of her connection to his soul. "Though," Ichigo said. It might be an order, but it was a simple one, and one Grimjo wanted to follow. The Espada stepped into Sanido, clearly reappearing a bit too close for comfort for the Shinigami, because the stranger tripped back and scrambled to draw his sword. Grimjo laughed, Ichigo saw it in the shake of his shoulders, and he could hear it bounce off the pavement, raucous and patronizing. It had been a while since the Rancor could make an impression, and as much as Ichigo enjoyed the sound, it wasn't settling the Shinigami's nerves any. Rukia said something to Grimjo, but it was too little, too late, and the Shinigami attacked. Grimjo blocked with a raised arm and a bark of laughter. Fidgeting, Ichigo muttered, "Reel it in, Grimjo. Come on." The Shinigami tried again, but he was even less effective than before. Grimjo caught his sword and took it from him. Great. The Shinigami decided this was a good chance to run, which was about the worst thing he could have done. Ichigo didn't think Grimjo could resist chasing when something ran, all it did was rile him up. Grimjo buzzed into Sanido to cut him off, and Rukia stepped into Shunpo at the same moment, putting herself between them. Ichigo ground his teeth, wondering if he shouldn't intervene. He didn't want to give this guy a heart attack, so he waited, but Rukia didn't know how to wrangle a cat. Grimjo was a slippery bastard, he already had his hand on the Shinigami. Ichigo felt bad for the guy, it was like watching a cat batter a mouse, and this was quickly devolving into chaos. "That's it, I'm intervening." "Why? This is the most amusing thing I've seen all day." "You just answered your own question." Pushing away from the wall with a disappointed exhale, Ichigo stepped through La Sanger to the parking lot. It wasn't intentional, but that was enough for the trio to freeze, all eyes on him. He didn't mean to command all of their attention, but it seemed inevitable. Grimjo was holding the man a foot and a half off the ground, Rukia was handing off his bicep like a monkey, and the Shinigami was poised to kick Grimjo in the balls. "That's enough of that," Ichigo said. Raising his hand, Ichigo could sense the tightly wound cluster of souls that made up the Shinigami's Zanpakuto lying wedged somewhere under a car tire. Pulling it through La Sanger, the blade fell a couple of inches from La Sanger into his open palm. Eyes flicking to his conduit, Ichigo ordered, "Put the man down, Grimjo." Grimjo gave him an annoyed scowl, then loosened his fist, and the man fell on his ass. "Good enough." Ichigo paced over to him, and he honestly hoped he wasn't as scary as this guy seemed to think he was. Telling him to relax wasn't going to do a damn thing. Holding his Zanpakuto out to him held first, the Shinigami shakily accepted it. He held it out before him defensively. Ichigo could see the shiver in the blade as the Shinigami trembled, and he tried not to sigh. Ichigo held his hand down to him, and the Shinigami blinked at it, uncomprehending. "He's offering you a hand up, you rude asshole," Grimjo said. Ichigo shot Grimjo a disapproving look, then looked back down at the Shinigami. "I'm not gonna hurt you, promise." Rukia nodded and told the Shinigami. "See, I told you he looked scary." Both Ichigo and the Shinigami's eyes snapped to Rukia. Ichigo frowned, "You told him that?" She gave him a helpless look and crossed her arms. "Was I supposed to lie?" Grimjo scoffed. "He doesn't look scary, he is scary, you're doing him a disservice." Ichigo rolled his eyes, and he figured this Shinigami had never seen a Hallow that was about to eat him do that, because he finally took his hand. Ichigo pulled him to his feet with ease, and immediately gave him some space. It might not mean much practically, but he liked to think he was thoughtful. The Shinigami lowered his sword but didn't sheath it, looking from a scowling antsy Grimjo back to him. "You're Kurosaki?" "Yes," Ichigo answered. For a moment it seemed the Shinigami struggled to say what was on his mind. What are you? Grimmjow answered for Ichigo. A fucking demigod, so put the sword away, you're embarrassing yourself. The Shinigami looked confused, mostly. Ichigo resisted the urge to sigh and shot Grimmjow a chiding look. What? Grimmjow snapped. He couldn't cut you with that thing if you had one foot in the grave and were in a coma. Grimmjow was right, but it was still rude. Look, I just want to send you to Soul Society. The man's eyes widened. But the Senkai. He's the Senkaimon, Grimmjow interrupted. So let's get on with it, there's a lot of you fuckers. The man frowned and eyed Ichigo warily. His eyes returned to Rukia, the only one present that he recognized. She said, he's telling the truth. A bit of back and forth later, and Ichigo tapped the Shinigami on the chest, sending him directly to Soul Society. He didn't need to touch him, but it certainly made people feel better to assume that he did. Half a day and 4 Shinigami later, the trio were down to a system. Even if Ichigo could go a long stretch without sleeping, because of Altiza or not, Rukia and Grimmjow still needed sleep and food. Ichigo thought it creeped Rukia out a bit that he didn't need to eat. She wouldn't say it, but the look on her face was easy enough to read. He was different, and reminders of that were always a stumbling point for her, and he couldn't blame her, he could relate to that, there was hardly a person he knew that was unchanged from his time. Ichigo could have brought them back to Soul Society to sleep, but after a small argument and a tiny meltdown from Grimmjow, Ichigo caved. Hijacking an empty hotel room in a city he'd never visited before was a new experience, but they were souls, no one would be the wiser. Rukia took a bed, sprawled out like a starfish, and was out like a light. She had an absurd amount of trust in him, but he knew it was also because she worked too hard. He could pretend not to notice the dark smudges under her eyes, the clench of her jaw and the tension in her shoulders, and in return, she pretended not to notice when he moved too quickly, forgot to blink, or stared off into space. It was a silent agreement to convince themselves things were as they used to be. The chaos of his thoughts were juxtaposed by the soft whisper of her breath and the peaceful hum of her reiatsu. He felt Grimmjow's eyes on him, the presence of his soul expectant, whereas Rukia's was not. Ichigo didn't want to be there anymore, so he left her in the dark of the room. Sliding open the door, Ichigo stepped outside onto a balcony overlooking a sea of warm lights and the murmur of a culture he didn't even recognize. It didn't matter where he was, it could have been Karakura and it would have felt just as removed. Grimmjow caught his mood as he often did those days, following him onto the balcony. His conduit stepped up beside him, crossing his arms and leaning on the rail. Ichigo knew disapproval would only be met with stubborn resistance, but he tried anyways. Sleep, Grimmjow. He didn't give an answer or leave. Ichigo should have expected as much, Grimmjow never did what he wanted, and that was sometimes frustrating, but never unwelcome. The wind was cold and heavy with the salt of the sea, a scent that seemed to stir something in Grimmjow. Nostalgia, pain, longing, yet the conduit seemed determined not to acknowledge it. Grimmjow asked, "Why here?" "No reason," Ichigo said. Then he realized that was a lie. "It isn't Karakura." Grimmjow eyed him and said, "You've been weird ever since we got here." "To the hotel?" "No, Dumbus, living world." "Oh." Ichigo looked across at him, and Grimmjow looked back, his usual scowl softened with uncertainty. Ichigo thought he hid his feelings well enough, and despite that, Grimmjow knew. They spent enough time together, it was inevitable, and he had access to his soul. Ichigo knew from experience that it didn't help him understand people when you had glimpses into their soul. People were complex things with context and thought he just didn't have access to. The same went for Grimmjow. His Frachian felt the things he tried to hide, but why he felt them and what caused them was still mostly a mystery to the other. From the look Grimmjow gave him, his Frachian could only guess, but was concerned enough to ask. Ichigo answered, skirting the truth. "It's just weird to be here." "The hotel," Grimmjow said. Ichigo shot him a glare, and Grimmjow pretended not to know what it was for. Letting out a heavy breath, Ichigo scowled down at the city. "It's just Strangetto exist outside all this." "Yeah, being dead-s." "You know what I mean," Ichigo said. "You were alive, human, you're not so special," Grimmjow growled. "Were." Past tense. That shouldn't bother him so much but it did. "You're trying to make me feel better," Ichigo said. Grimmjow drummed his fingers on the railing and leaning forward, his restlessness transferring to his foot. He lifted and dropped it, bouncing his toes in a steady rhythm. "Even with Daikonogen." "Especially with Daikonogen," Ichigo answered. "The temptation is there, from all of them." The gods pushed and pulled and yearned, and Ichigo was just one soul. How long before he lost that battle? How long before people were nothing but souls and power? "I thought we fixed this." Grimmjow sounded angry, but Ichigo sensed his worry buried within it. "Postponed," Ichigo corrected. "It's only been weeks, and living world already feels unfamiliar." "I don't know what that means, Kurosaki." "Cities, streets, beds, noise, Piaplete's just a window into a life I can't have." shouldn't have. For a long moment, Grimjo just watched him, then he asked, "What's your screeching twin have to say about this?" Ichigo hadn't considered how silent Zangetsu had been until that moment. Kaneko can mind his own fucking business. Ichigo answered easily, "He isn't saying anything." Grimjo got a hand around his shoulder and turned him around to face him. "You're hiding things from me again. It isn't your problem." Grimjo's eyes narrowed a touch, and Ichigo saw that those words actually hurt him. Ichigo hoped the ranker would back off and internalize, but he stayed put, annoyingly aware of Ichigo's intentions. Grimjo said, "Don't think I don't see the way you look at things." Ichigo could only assume what he meant, but none of it was positive. "What do you mean? You barely blink, you hardly even move." Ichigo looked away, and Grimjo growled, "It ain't an insult, it's an observation. You're one distracted guy, and fuck me if I don't know why." He sounded so distraught, Ichigo had to look back. Grimjo's brows were drawn into his usual scowl, features always so severe, yet now they were dampened with fatigue. Every day that passed he seemed a little more tired, a little more restless. The conduit was strong, but Ichigo knew how fragile his spiritual form really was. Grimjo still needed to eat, still needed to sleep, he was mortal. One touch and Ichigo knew he could kill him, and that was a thought that turned his stomach and filled him with dread. Ichigo answered Grimjo's unspoken questions with half of the truth. "You already know why, Grimjo. It's same conflict as usual. The gods want, and I won't let them take. Then what is it about living world? It's nauseating to look at someone and see nothing but energy to consume or destroy. The gods are indifferent." He looked back at the city, hiding an expression he knew would betray him. "I'm not." Grimjo regarded him, silent, working out all the things he couldn't or wouldn't say. "Is it because they're human?" "It's because they're weak," Ichigo hissed. Inviting Sunyata deeper into his soul, it rushed over that spark of anger and snuffed it under a pool of fuzzy indifference. Too much, too much, too much. His grip loosened, allowing Daikonogen to take its place. The slide from indifference into ardent emotion was sickening, his breath leaving his lungs in soft sigh of pain. He could feel Grimjo's eyes boring into him, so he shifted the conversation back onto the conduit. "You call yourself many things, Grimjo, but you aren't evil." The conduit snorted. "Debatable. Would you kill a kitten?" Suspicion entered Grimjo's voice, sensing a trap. "Where are you going with this? Would you?" Ichigo pressed. "Shit, Kurosaki, why? Don't pretend, I know you wouldn't. I'm not an executioner, what the fuck? Then there's the difference. Some part of me wants to kill them." Ichigo's voice fell, small and broken. "And it would be easy." Looking back towards the ranker, Grimjo had pushed back from the railing, shoulders squared and tense, frowning at him. Ichigo didn't like that look, so he looked back at wavering city lights and a sea full of souls. "No, I don't like it here." Kurosaki the ranker's voice tilted downward, a sound that made Ichigo's chest tight with shame. "Pity?" Ichigo snarled, "now." Grimjo grabbed his shoulder, shoving him around and back against the railing. Zangetsu's edge ground against the stone through the wrap, but Ichigo didn't move. The ranker leaned in, more than aware Ichigo was letting this happen. "What the fuck am I here for if not to fix this shit?" "You can't fix it." "I can fucking try," Grimjo hissed. Ichigo started to look away, but Grimjo's grip on his chin stopped him. "Don't look at them. Look at me." So he looked. The obsidian lines of his mask were traced in soft golden light, outlining both of their regrets. His eyes were no better, loss anger darkened his sclera and made him look so much like the Ajuchas he'd seen in his inner world. Pantera. Looking beneath flesh and bones to his soul, Altiza was slowly and steadily carving him out, eating him alive to protect its precious host. Ichigo's anger collapsed and left him empty. He didn't even need Sunyata. Grimjo said, "I don't like that look either." Ichigo had no doubt about that. Grimjo's soul was tumultuous at best, but if he listened to it, it ached. Much of it was his fault, by direct and indirect consequence. Ichigo said, "If I take any more from you there won't be anything left." "I can take it," Grimjo insisted. Ichigo sighed through his nose and reached for his chest, his fingertips resting over his heart. A heart Grimjo liked to pretend he didn't have. "If I keep taking the things that make you won't be there anymore." "You don't know that." "I do, better than you," Ichigo countered. He let his hand fall and he watched the ranker, unblinking. Grimjo's hand slipped from his chin to his neck, his thumb resting over the hollow of his throat. Ichigo noted the proximity didn't bother him, and he didn't think it was because Grimjo couldn't physically harm him. For whatever reason, Grimjo tested his tolerance to his touch, his fingers hovering featherlight over the pulse of an artery. Even if he couldn't hurt him, the ranker knew well enough that should garner some sort of response. Yet Ichigo didn't move. If there was one person he trusted inside and out, it was this hollow. His hollow. Ichigo noted something entirely inconsequential. "I always forget you're taller than me." Grimjo laughed, the sound strained but genuine, and he dropped his hand. Changing the subject. Lips quirking up into a small grin, Ichigo said, maybe. Grimjo wasn't kind enough to let the subject change, not this time. If you won't let me do something about it, then talk to me, something, but this distance, silence, detachment. The humor fell from his face, and his voice fell. This is unbearable. That surprised Ichigo. He didn't expect Grimjo to be so distressed. He sensed Grimjo's disquiet, but he assumed it was for entirely different reasons. Ichigo answered, you're already doing something, you're here. With Grimjo's soul clutched within Altiza's grasp, he never felt far away, but his presence there beside him had become familiar and expected. He'd once been used to being alone, but that time had come and gone. Now the rancor felt like home. Grimjo griped, I'm not doing anything. I know that's difficult for you to understand, but it's enough. Not only difficult, potentially impossible. Ichigo wouldn't be happy sitting on his hands, so he reasoned, neither would Grimjo. You're happy with this? Happy? Ichigo thought about that. Happiness seems elusive, but it was present, merely overwhelmed by responsibility and the clamor of gods. He answered, happier than I thought I could be. Grimjo looked skeptical, so he elaborated. I don't need to tell you about loneliness, you know it better than I ever did. He trailed off, uncertain how to continue. Yara here. You won't let anyone else close, I'm nothing special. Ichigo barked out a laugh. It's not because I won't let anyone else stay. You know why I let you close. Cause better some Hallow than your family. Grimjo, you know that's not it, why do you do that? Do fucking what? Grimjo snarled. There it was, the Altiza-fueled rabid want for violence. He'd kept it beaten down well enough, Ichigo was impressed. Try to get a rise out of me. Grimjo shouted, cause I can't get. Ichigo whirled, grabbing a fistful of Grimjo's jacket and pushed them both through La Sanger. Anything else out of you? They were on the roof, far away enough not to wake Rukia if she wasn't already awake. I feel what you're doing, don't think I don't. Ichigo blinked at him, honestly unsure what he meant. Grimjo's face sharpened into a grimace. I felt it with Jin, and I feel it now. Ichigo let him go, taking a small step back, but Grimjo stepped in close again. Before it was anger, it was a hell of a lot of Altiza, but now it's gone. Poof, gone, but I still want to kill everything that walks across my path. Altiza ain't gone. Nothing is that easy, especially not with you. What are you accusing one of? Ichigo asked. Grimjo ignored that in favor of a question. So which god is it? Ichigo was silent, so Grimjo started to guess. Daikonogen. He searched Ichigo's reaction, and his eyes narrowed. Nah, that thing only makes it worse. Sunyata then. Ichigo frowned, resisting the urge to look away now that he'd been found out. He wasn't proud of it, he didn't want anyone to know. Rukia was none the wiser, but Grimjo knew him, knew this peaceful facade was just that, a facade. I can't afford to lose control, Ichigo said, not here. You mean you can't afford to feel? Ichigo flinched, struggling to hold Grimjo's accusatory glare. He deflected, is there a difference? The two aren't mutually exclusive. Maybe I want to be selfish. Grimjo shouted. Selfish? Ichigo didn't follow, his brows creased in thought, but Grimjo wasn't done. If I'm stuck dying a slow death, I'm not gonna waste the time I've got with this watered down version of you, not for a minute longer than I have to. Get mad, get upset, I hate this. Ichigo tensed at the disgust wrapped around that word, hate. He felt it in the ugly twist of his words and the heat in his eyes. Grimjo might not have come out and said it, but he loathed him as he was, despised it, and Ichigo felt a stab of shame, even through Sunyata's haze. Grimjo noticed that shame, and with blood in the water he didn't relent. The fuck am I here for if not to take it so you don't have to? Ichigo's brows fell, the look in his eyes hardening. And if you're not enough? The thought lingered between them within a heavy cloud of doubt. Grimjo got even closer, painfully so. You're scared. I'm not strong enough. Strong enough for what? Grimjo pressured him, desperate for something, anything. Ichigo felt to deny him what he wanted now would be cruel. Grimjo had nothing, he hardly asked for anything. Sure, he fought to take it, but it wasn't often he demanded Ichigo do something. He let his grip on Sunyata slide, feeling the burn of Altiza replace the cold numbness he was quickly growing fond of. Slippery slope. It had barely been weeks, and he was already sliding. Ichigo's voice was low, so unwilling to give voice to the fears he had to face. I'm not strong enough to feel. Bullshit, Grimjo hissed. I make mistakes. So what? My mistakes hurt people. So fucking what? Ichigo abruptly turned away, taking a few steps in a surge of annoyance. Gathering himself, his eyes roamed the rooftop, never resting. He knew his annoyance was only present because he was afraid. They were alone on that rooftop, but they had an audience in his soul. Just about everyone in the Gate 13 had a front row seat to his mental breakdown, but Grimjo asked, and he deserved to know. He turned to face the rancor again and let his grip on everything go. It all rushed back, filling the void in his heart. It was too much, too quickly. It tightened his throat, choking him with it, the rage seizing his muscles like coiled vipers. He grit his teeth through a growl. You want me to say I'm jealous, that I'm angry? Spiteful? Petty? Who gives a shit what I feel? I do. That stopped Ichigo short, staring back at Grimmjow in shock. Grimmjow looked back in mirrored confusion. It didn't seem to be his admission, but the force of his conviction. Ichigo wanted to know why, but Grimmjow wanted to move on. The ranker asked, you're jealous? Ichigo's thoughts once again derailed to Aizen. The man knew. He knew it would come to this, and the Shinigami laughed in his face. Don't go there, King, it isn't worth it. It really wasn't. He could never be a part of this, there was no changing that, but comparing himself to Aizen wasn't productive. Yeah, jealous, Ichigo said. I miss going to school, worrying about stupid shit that doesn't even matter, having friends. Thanks, asshole, Grimmjow interjected. Ichigo let slip a bark of laughter. You're more than a friend, Grimmjow. I don't know what you are. From the look on Grimmjow's face, he didn't either, and he wasn't offering up any suggestions. The conduit shoved his hands in his pockets and scowled. Why the fuck would you want to be some sheep in a crowd? Because it's simple. You would hate it. Ichigo looked away, eyes landing on the city sprawled below him, breathed in the raging hum of life, and had to agree. Probably. Doesn't stop me from wondering what could have been. You're damn near a god, besides all the horseshit about your soul, why wouldn't you want power? Isn't it obvious? Ichigo looked back at him when he didn't answer, noting the furrow of confusion in his brow. Ichigo was aware that for someone that clawed and scraped for power all their life, his outlook was strange. I used to be like you, all I wanted was to be stronger, but I wanted it to protect people. Still scared you'll hurt me? Yes, Ichigo said. He moved, suddenly inches from the Aranker, but Grimmjow was used to it, he didn't even flinch. I still have restraint, I'm not that far gone. He reached for Grimmjow, surprising the Aranker when he reached for his bare cheek rather than his mask. I know I can stop myself, but I have to try. His fingers smoothed over the arc of his cheekbone, testing Grimmjow's reaction, then pressed his palm to his jaw. Grimmjow stopped breathing, but his heart pounded like a trapped bird. Kurosa. I hate that the urge is there. This need to devour, obliteratize, his voice broke and twisted over that word. I'm jealous. I wish I knew what it was like without all of that noise. I don't remember banality. Are you jealous of me? Ichigo paused, because he hadn't given it any conscious thought. Grimmjow was a constant presence in his life, but as he stared back at the conduit, he realized he was. Yee, I think I am. What the fuck for? Ichigo said, your life wasn't all bad, don't act like you don't remember what it was like. Sunshine, seafoam, and a dazzling smile, those memories couldn't belong to anyone but Grimmjow. I know you do. Grimmjow jerked his head to remove his hand, but Ichigo stepped closer, pressing his palm flat to his cheek. The Aranker froze and didn't try to back away again, watching him carefully. Grimmjow's expression was guarded, but through that contact and through his soul, Ichigo felt his conduit's heart rubbed raw. Grimmjow already knew he'd seen parts of his past, but the Aranker was deeply private, and dragging it to the forefront was clearly the last thing he wanted. It was knowledge Ichigo wished he didn't have. I don't mean to see your memories. Something sparked in Grimmjow's eyes, and the Aranker fought to turn the conversation back. Then you know, why the fuck would you be jealous of that? You still don't understand, Ichigo said. It isn't a single part of you, it's everything. You might be my conduit, but you're still mortal, Grimmjow supplied. I wasn't going to say that. Grimmjow continued as if he hadn't spoken. You're jealous of mortality. Mortality death. Surrounded by it, yet he hardly wanted to think about it. That struck close enough to home that it ached, searing a line into his soul, someplace deeper than even Alteza could reach. King. Nothing but a single word, his hollow's tone laden with a reminder of that agonizing moment in Hueco Mundo. Sisters dead, hope crushed, his heart burned away by the scorching fire of pain. There was no afterlife for him, this was it. There was no death to happily embrace, there was no peace left in it for Ichigo. Ichigo's face fell and he pulled his hand back, but Grimmjow's hand snatched it, calloused fingers rough along the back of his hand. Blue eyes locked on his, wide in concern. Ichigo held still, he didn't squash his feelings, he didn't run from them, not like before. Grimmjow asked him not to, and that meant everything. His voice felt thick in his throat, but for fuck's sake at least he didn't cry. It hasn't even happened, how stupid is that? Kurosaki, you're only giving me bits and pieces, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. The words he chose were aggressive, but they lacked the force of his usual cranky temper. Ichigo pulled his hand away, not because he wanted to, and turned to put his back to the rooftop wall. He sat on the edge, noting it was terrifyingly short. Seemed a good place to jump, he couldn't help but notice, even when heights were no longer a fear. He didn't see a door to get up here, so it probably wasn't even a hazard, but he thought it anyways. Grimjo sat next to him, close enough that his knee touched, and rest his arms over his thighs. "Talk," the ranker demanded. And Ichigo caved, his cobbled-together composure crumbling. "No one's gone, they're not dead, they're alive." His shoulders jerked with a rough laugh, one that sounded more like a gutted sob. "And that's just it, they're mortal. So they become souls, you're in soul society all the time. And then what?" Disgust curled Ichigo's lip, his eyes roaming over the water pooled into the dips of the roof. They watched their brother slowly lose his mind. "Fuck," Grimjo growled, "that's decades off. You've got time. I should be dead." "Kurosaki?" Ichigo couldn't be sure if he heard a question or merely appalled outrage in Grimjo's voice. It would have been the perfect moment. Grimjo's hand fisted in the front of his shahakusho, and Ichigo found himself inches away from blazing blue eyes. "The fuck are you saying?" Grimjo growled. "You said you wanted honesty," Ichigo said. Infliction weakened Grimjo's resolve, but he didn't back down. "What's all this shit about dying? You're not allowed to die." Ichigo laughed, a small broken sound. "That's just it, I'm not allowed to die, they won't let me." There wasn't just anger in those eyes anymore, Ichigo finally saw understanding. Grimjo tightened his grip, pulling him closer, enough that Ichigo put a hand on Grimjo's knee to keep from falling into his lap. "You want to die?" Grimjo looked and sounded angry, but his heart betrayed something pained. "I'm not suicidal," Ichigo reassured him. Confusion washed over Grimjo's face, the ranker's hand tightening hard enough his knuckles cracked. "It was my last chance to die, there's no one left that can kill me." Ichigo's voice fell with a growl, his throat tight with pain and rage he kept pretending didn't exist. "So yes, I'm fucking jealous. You won't lose your mind, I won't let you, I'll kill you. I'll kill you and I'll have to fucking live with that until I don't, cause I'll be fucking crazy." Breathing hard, Ichigo didn't remember lifting his hand to Grimjo's throat, but it was there, tight enough he knew Grimjo couldn't breathe. The shock on Grimjo's face slackened his features in a way Ichigo had only seen in sleep. He expected rage in return, not this. Ichigo loosened his grip but didn't remove his hand. "Say something. This is what's been bothering you?" Grimjo's voice was shockingly even, and Ichigo realized what he felt. Guilt. Pity. Ichigo shoved him back hard enough that Grimjo fell and had to catch himself on the ground with both hands, his knee splashing into a puddle. That felt good, but it also didn't feel like enough, and the very fact he liked seeing Grimjo on his hands and knees turned his stomach. He wanted to hurt him, and he didn't know if those feelings were his own. Grimjo looked up at him, and the shine of fear in his eyes made Ichigo rock back on his heels. He wanted to hurt him, he wanted to protect him, and those two urges melted into something sickening and ugly. Turning away with a shout of frustration, Ichigo stepped through La Sanger, putting distance between them before he did something he would regret. Hands clenched into fists, his claws scored his palms and slicked his fingers in blood. Why was he so angry? He's the one that dragged Grimjo down, and now he hated him for it. How the fuck was that fair? He turned in circles, panicking, feeling Grimjo's eyes on him as sharply as he felt the ranker's pity. That emotion was entirely unwanted. He snarled, "Don't you dare." Grimjo got to his feet, he heard the scuff of his shoes and the shift of his clothes, but he refused to look at him. He let out a ragged breath, reaching for Daikonogen without realizing, not until he jerked away from it and the sudden ache of his heart. All the light in the city was abruptly snuffed out, banished along with Daikonogen. They stood in darkness, and a silence more akin to Hueco Mundo, the light pollution of the city gone. Abandoning all sense, Grimjo walked over to him. Some of that fear was still present, but Grimjo disregarded it and approached him anyways. Why did he do that? Why did he ignore his instincts like that? Eyes on Grimjo's feet, Ichigo refused to look at him, but he didn't run, he was better than that. At least he told himself he was, but it could also be curiosity. Grimjo planted his feet directly before him and startled Ichigo when his fingertips brushed along his jaw. Ichigo's eyes snapped up to meet Grimjo's in shock. He felt the tremble in the Aranker's arm, and he finally understood where that fear came from. He was nervous, this was different, new, and unfamiliar territory. Blue eyes met his, raw and unguarded, brows furrowed, his lips a tight line. His conduit flattened his hand to his cheek, and his palm burned like fire. His mind staggered over the reality that Grimjo touched him. He hadn't ever touched him like that before. No one had. "Good, you're listening." Grimjo's voice sounded thick, tight with emotion Ichigo knew he'd never dare show anyone. "You wanna hate me? Hate me. You wanna hurt me? Do it." Shut the fuck up. I'm not done." Grimjo's hand slipped higher to fist in his hair, pulling Ichigo closer. "I have a hard time telling how much of your anger is you, and how much is Altiza, or Daikonogen, or whatever, but this. All this shit, is you. You can pretend you're not a wreck with your fucking friends, but not with me. I asked for this, I ain't backing down from it. I'm not a coward." Grimjo was many things, but Ichigo would never call him a coward. A coward wouldn't invite any of this onto themselves, let alone face it head on when they were dragged into this level of bullshit. He said, "You don't deserve this." Grimjo's face twisted into an ugly smile. "Talking like a god again, you fucking asshole. You don't tell me what I deserve. Fuck you." And he was right. Ichigo closed his eyes, letting out a slow breath, one wrapped up in a sound he didn't even realize he'd made. Grimjo pressed his forehead to his, and Ichigo didn't move. He was so used to violence, his thoughts stuttered to a halt under a gentle touch. Weeks of the Aranker's presence made it shockingly easy to accept. The Aranker's grip tightened on the back of his neck, and he growled, "Fuck if it ain't fair. Do you see me judging you? I wish you would. Don't tell me what to do, Kurosaki. I don't want your pity," Ichigo hissed. "It's not as simple as that. Isn't it?" Ichigo asked, his voice contained in a bitter laugh. "Just listen for a fucking second. You make the best of it, but I feel it, you have to know I feel it too. You're not free." Ichigo's heart plummeted at the truth in those words, his masquerade ripped apart in one breath. Grimjo continued, his fingers tugged his hair, pulling at the roots. "And I hate it." Ichigo tried to pull away, but Grimjo held fast, clawing desperately at his hair. Ichigo stilled at his silent plea, pressing back against his forehead. He wondered if Grimjo was afraid he'd see his expression. His conduit spoke, his voice so quiet Ichigo had to strain to hear. "You think it's pity, but you're wrong." Afraid of the answer, Ichigo swallowed and asked, "Then what?" Grimjo's hand moved, willing his hand to relax, and his palm clasped the back of Ichigo's neck, holding him close, in a grip that was possessive yet oddly gentle. For a long moment, the space was shared by nothing but their breath and the wind. Calloused fingers dragged harsh lines over the ridges of his vertebrae, then veered upwards, his fingers tangling in his hair. Grimjo tightened his grip, pulling him closer, his answer small and broken. "Grief, Kurosaki." Confusion weighed on Ichigo so heavy, he tried to pull back to see him, but Grimjo held tighter, hopeful he wouldn't see his face. So Ichigo remained close to him, sparing his pride, and focused instead on the tight hiss of his breath. Ichigo asked, "What for?" "For you, Dumbus." Ichigo's breath caught in his throat, biting his lower lip. "For him." Grimjo kept speaking, words tumbling from his lips as he rambled, "You were always good at hiding. With the Shinigami sharing your soul, I should have known that you would do it again, stupid, I should have known." Grimjo knew he was hiding, and that hurt more than the confession itself. All his ugly secrets were drawn out, Grimjo wasn't letting him hide, and despite all his power felt vulnerable. It hadn't occurred to him that Grimjo might mourn what he'd lost. It wasn't that he thought Grimjo lacked empathy, he just didn't think the other had cared. He shouldn't care. Ichigo was the one to grant him power, but by mere proximity Grimjo was suffering. His espada reached for him, and like Icarus, he was burning up, the price was too high. Ichigo argued, "You've got it wrong, you're not responsible for me. You're mine." Grimjo snarled, "You have no idea, do you, Kurosaki? I couldn't shake you if I tried, you're in my thoughts, my soul, like fucking poison, and I can't get rid of you." It was true, but it didn't hurt any less. Ichigo flinched back, heart aching, easily fighting Grimjo's hold, but the Aranker stepped forward, his voice rough. "I ain't talking about Altiza, Dumbus." Ichigo stilled, not comprehending. Grimjo said, "You reeled me in and I'm here, so don't shut me out." He added as an afterthought, fingers wrestling a tighter hold of tangled black hair. "Fuck you for that." Ichigo got a handful of his jacket, to push him back or pull him closer, he wasn't sure, but once he had him, he did nothing, only listened, worried if he spoke, Grimjo might stop. "Did it ever occur to you that maybe I'm selfish? If you feel shit, I feel shit, and it ain't because I'm stuck feeling your soul." That admission startled Ichigo, and when Grimjo didn't elaborate, he fished for answers. "What do you mean?" After a long pause, Grimjo admitted, "I don't know." Trying to pull back, Ichigo encountered resistance again. He stopped fighting Grimjo's hold and sighed, "I'm not hiding from you anymore, don't hide from me." Grimjo didn't move, and Ichigo wrestled with a word that scraped his ego and pride in a way it never had before. "Please." Grimjo let him go, his hand loosening and allowing Ichigo to pull back to see his face. His hand lingered on the side of his neck, palm much warmer than Ichigo expected it to be. Lifting his eyes to meet Grimjo's, his conduit met his gaze with a steady look, one without the barriers he was used to. Blue eyes blazed against a backdrop of black, and Ichigo tried to understand how eyes so fierce could be so sad. Without giving it much thought, Ichigo unfisted his hand from his jacket and reached for his mask. Fear flashed in Grimjo's eyes, and Ichigo paused and let go of the lie. "I don't need to touch you to feel your heart." Panic spread across Grimjo's face, and Ichigo closed the gap, his palm resting over the uneven sandpaper surface of his mask. Grimjo stiffened, but watched expectantly, silently demanding an explanation. Ichigo traced the sharp edge of his mask with his thumb, the ache in Grimjo's heart mirroring his own. I touched you because I didn't want you to be afraid of me, but there's no reason for a lie, not anymore. Voice thick, Grimjo asked, if you can feel my heart anyways, why are you touching me? Ichigo scoffed softly. Because I want to. He smiled, but it hurt, baring his teeth in a grimace more than any expression of joy. Just looking at you hurts. I did this, I hurt you, and it makes me hate you more. Why do you stay? Why do you let me do this? Grimjo lifted his hand to cover Ichigo's, shockingly gentle, while Ichigo's grew more violent, tendons straining as he gripped his mask, the irrational desire to crush his heart for daring to trust him with it, making his hand tremble. Grimjo grimaced in pain and said, Zangetsu did this. I am Zangetsu, Ichigo hissed. So what, I want you alive, Grimjo said. I don't blame you. Ichigo tightened his grip, enough that his mask creaked under the pressure. You should. Grimjo's response was stubbornly even. I don't. Why do you let me do this? Ichigo shouted. Grimjo didn't answer, but that sadness still softened his eyes and twisted Ichigo's heart. He didn't deserve that, not after everything he'd done, everything he wanted to do. Gritting his teeth, Ichigo shoved back, throwing them both through La Sanger. Slamming Grimjo back against the roof access door, the metal rang, hollow and heavy with the impact. Grimjo said nothing, there was no judgment there, just a bundle of emotions wrapped up in grief. Shoving Grimjo's head back by his mask, Ichigo snarled, why? Forced to bare his throat, Grimjo just took it, he did nothing but glare, those eyes burning into him with such steady confidence. Ichigo hated it. Desperate for a reaction, Ichigo shoved a hand up against his stomach, pressing a clawed thumb along the rim of his hollow hole. That got a reaction. Grimjo let out a heavy, awful breath, brows twisting in anguish. Ichigo felt a stab of satisfaction and disgust, both wanting to stop himself and eager to continue. Grimjo's heart ached, struggling like a trapped animal, and Ichigo forced his palm down on his hollow hole, like he was trying to split Grimjo in half by it. The air rushed from Grimjo's lungs like he'd been punched, squeezing his eyes shut. Instinct had Grimjo fighting back, clawing to remove Ichigo's hands. His knees buckled so Ichigo's steely grip on his mask was the only thing keeping him on his feet. This is all I have for you, Grimjo. Pain. King, you're going to kill him. Fine. King. Grimjo trembled under his hands, his claws sinking deep into his hollow hole, tearing at his soul. Tears fell from eyes screwed tight, his breath coming in short tight pants, words and thoughts stolen from him. It felt good, it also made him feel sick. Guts turning over in self-hatred, Ichigo considered killing him, and the pain Grimjo felt was suddenly his own. Loosening his grip, Ichigo spat. Hate me. Grimjo added in a rattling breath, those blue eyes locking on his own with no visible difference other than pain. I can't. Why not? It's easy. I use you, I hurt you, I'm tearing you apart. Don't let me down now, Grimjo. Fight me, hate me. Grimjo's brows drew tight, lashes wet with tears, a bright blush of shame, dusting his cheeks and racing up towards his ears. You ask me why. So tell me, Ichigo demanded. He spoke, soft and raspy, his throat tight with emotion. I love you. His voice was so soft, Ichigo was sure he heard him wrong. Eyes widening, his grip fell slack, and Grimjo crumpled against the wall, sliding down it to sit in a heap on the ground. Don't act so surprised, Kurosaki, the Arankor muttered. You knew. Did he though? Ichigo stared down at Grimjo, but the Arankor didn't look at him, he looked at the rooftop, curled protectively around his hollow hole. Shame struck Ichigo like a wall, and Grimjo looked up, but there was no blame written on his face, only understanding. You think I don't get you, Kurosaki. I do. I want to hurt you, and I hate it. He hated himself, but he also reveled in it. He shouldn't feel like that, but he did, and for some reason, Grimjo just took it. I don't blame you, Grimjo said, and there was no waver in his heart, he meant every word. Goddamn him. You should. Fuck off, I do what I want, and I'm exactly where I wanna be. Grimjo's lips curled in anger and he hissed, always the martyr, everything's always about you. Fuck off. I choose what I want, and this is it. So many words left the Arankor breathless, arms still wrapped around his middle like he was holding himself together. And the fucker was right. He didn't hate him like Ichigo wanted, but he never, ever did as he was told. Grimjo blinked and looked away, something cold creeping into the other's heart. Ichigo didn't like it, so he abandoned caution and moved over him, standing above him. Grimjo watched, wary and expecting violence, and that twisted Ichigo's heart. That's what he'd wanted, or rather, what he thought he did, but fuck if it didn't hurt. Standing between his knees and planting a hand on the wall above Grimjo, Ichigo slid down to crouch before him. His claws traced the wall, and he left his hand by Grimjo's cheek, pinning him with a single look. Ichigo said, I didn't give you an answer. Grimjo looked confused, then understanding lit up his face. Don't expect you to say it. Never did. I love you. Ichigo wasn't sure if everything or nothing had changed. Grimjo was more loyal than he should be, he did things he wouldn't expect of anyone, and he did them willingly. Ichigo shouldn't have been surprised, but he was. He didn't deserve it, but Grimjo did whatever the fuck he wanted, there was no sense telling him no. Not when those 3 words sank into his heart and filled him with warmth. Grimjo said, I don't think I've ever known anyone as strong as you before. You must have felt my envy. Ichigo frowned, his expression shifting into a grimace. I thought it was hate. They feel a lot alike, don't they? Grimjo mused, and Ichigo realized he was talking about him. Grimjo thought he hated him. That realization changed Ichigo's perspective. And you still loved me. He supposed it wasn't something Grimjo could control any more than he could. Even when he saw hatred and fear in the eyes of his friends, he never stopped loving them, it just hurt more. Grimjo carried on as if he hadn't stopped. You made me stronger and stronger, but Yao, you have always been something else. You think I didn't want what you had so badly that I wanted to eat you alive, tear your heart out and devour you. I did, I wanted to hurt you, kill you, destroy Yaoi. Don't know when I stopped wanting that. This was more like what Ichigo wanted to hear, but he wasn't sure why it had changed either. The only thing I want from you, Kurosaki, is you. God, that sounds pathetic. Grimjo looked away in sudden shame, and Ichigo reached out without thinking to grab his chin, forcing the rancor to look at him. Ichigo said, I don't know how you can stand it, but if you let me be selfish, I'm taking it. I don't think I'm strong enough to resist. Grimjo's brows scrunched together and he said, why are you apologizing for that? I told you to take it. You're strong, Kurosaki. I don't know how you're not raving mad already, everyone's got a weakness, I'm not gonna use yours against you. Grimjo was a weakness, a big one, both when it came to his sanity and his heart. Somehow it didn't bother Grimjo to let Ichigo violate all the trust he'd ever given him. How can you trust me when I use your weakness against you? Oh no, Kurosaki. You ask too many questions. You still jealous? Ichigo moved his hand to Grimjo's throat, gently squeezing, and Grimjo didn't react, at least, not in the way he should have. Yes, Ichigo said. But it's better. Good, cause I haven't got anything else to give you. As if he were making sacrifices to some god, and from the look in Grimjo's eyes, that was close to the truth. Ichigo said, I'd say I don't want anything from you, but I'd be lying. The tone in Grimjo's voice was somehow annoyed and sad. You're allowed to be selfish, Kurosaki. But like that. Ichigo didn't think that was right, yet Grimjo refused to judge him. Removing his hand, Ichigo reached down, gently smoothing his hand along the rim of the void in his belly. Grimjo tensed, his hands tightening on his own shakusho in an effort to hold himself back. When no pain came, he let out a sigh, watching Ichigo nervously. Ichigo said, I'm sorry. I told you I get it, Grimjo growled, destroy the things you don't deserve. Been there, done that. That was true, wasn't it? If anyone understood his stupid, fucked up logic, it was Grimjo. Ichigo's eyes narrowed, carefully smoothing his fingers along the edge of his hollow hole. Okay, I'm still sorry. That apology came to him easier than he might have expected, and the honestly and gentle touch was too much for Grimjo to face. The rancor took his wrist and pulled his hand away. Fine. Eyeing Ichigo's proximity, Grimjo asked, did those Soul Society clowns feel all of that? Ichigo sighed and said, probably. Grimjo's usual scowl returned, but softened by something Ichigo couldn't name. That S. A small smile turned up the corner of Ichigo's mouth, but he was too emotionally exhausted for it to remain. It is what it is. Despite your reasons, it needed calling out. Ichigo stood, shifting Grimjo's grip from his wrist to his hand, and pulled him up to stand. The rancor was unsteady on his feet, which was proof enough of Ichigo's mistake. Grimjo warned, don't you dare feel guilty. I'm trying not to, Ichigo said, then gave him a more honest answer. Despite whatever satisfaction I got from that, I don't like seeing you weak. Leveling a hard stare at Ichigo, Grimjo chose to dance around the subject. Implying I'm strong. Stop comparing yourself to me, Ichigo said, that's not fair. Hard not to, Grimjo shrugged. He leaned against the wall and let out a long tired sigh. I'll take that nap now. Ichigo reached for him, pulling him off the wall by the jacket, and waited for some nonverbal sign he was ready to go back to the room, to face a stranger that had witnesses one side of a very personal conversation. It didn't seem like either of them were ready for it, but rather than never face it and die of embarrassment, life carried on. Moments passed, then Grimjo gave him a small nod, and Ichigo brought them both back into the room through La Sanger. Rukia jumped, startled by their sudden appearance, and looked from the growing bruise on Grimjo's throat to Ichigo. Ichigo noticed her eyes were wet, and the instant he noticed, an embarrassed blush stained her cheeks. She didn't say anything, but the questions she wouldn't ask hung in the air unanswered. Ichigo wasn't sure why she was crying, if it was because of him or for him, but he wasn't going to ask, his pride had taken enough of a beating that night. Sorry, Rukia. Grimjo pulled away from his grip and Rukia's questioning gaze to throw himself down on the other bed, curling up with his back to her. Ichigo saw the uncomfortable tension in his shoulders and crossed the room to sit on the bed between him and Rukia. Most, if not all of that tension immediately faded. In some sick way, that pleased Ichigo's instincts. Grimmjow was his to destroy, to protect, and his conduit knew that. With Ichigo there, Grimmjow was safe, until he decided he shouldn't be. On the other hand, the human part of his heart thrilled at the knowledge that Grimmjow trusted him, and now he knew why. Grimmjow folded his arm under his mask, eyes on the wall, and Ichigo felt compelled to touch. He reached for his throat again, fingertips brushing the tense bruising skin. He had no intention of healing that, it was proof Grimmjow wanted, and proof of all the things Ichigo wanted to deny he felt. No more hiding. Blue eyes snapped up to meet his, curious, but whatever Grimmjow saw there made him blush and close his eyes. "Leave me alone, I'm sleeping." Drawing his hand back, Ichigo folded his arms and leaned against the wall, casting a look over to Rukia. "Go back to sleep." Ichigo lined his voice with enough authority to infuse his lack of desire to talk about anything that just occurred, both for his own sake and Grimmjow's. He liked her as a friend, but he wasn't even done working out what just happened himself. Rukia stared at him a long moment, then swiped her fingers over her cheek and laid down with her back to him, lacing his fingers over the back of her neck. Not so comfortable around him anymore, that was clear. That was fine, even if it hurt. He was being honest, that's what mattered to Grimmjow, so that's what mattered to him. Ichigo looked around the room, the silence uncomfortable for all of them, but it still didn't take long for Grimmjow to slip into unconsciousness. His breathing leveled and his usual scowl softened into a small frown. Eventually, Rukia fell asleep too, and Ichigo was left to his thoughts, but not alone. Stepping into his inner world, Ichigo faced his Hallow with a heart heavy with shame. "I was going to do something really stupid." Zangetsu watched him without judgment, merely frustration. "Not in your right mind these days, I can't blame you. That was all me, I wanted to kill him." Zangetsu let out a breath, looking more tired than Ichigo had ever known. "No king, it isn't. You're an angry fucker, but you wouldn't kill him. I wanted to." Zangetsu stepped into Sanido, stopping with his hand on his chest, just above the hole that cut straight through him. "Look around you." Ichigo followed his line of sight to his feet, the cracked concrete of his sinking inner world stopping him short. The concrete was seeping black, spreading from the fractures and staining his inner world with darkness so similar to the sand slowly consuming him. Ichigo sighed, understanding dampening his heart. It was only a matter of time. If it was sinking so deep he couldn't feel the difference, it was no wonder he thought those impulses were his own. And yet Grimmjow accepted him anyway. "What a fucking idiot," Ichigo muttered. He ran his hands over his face and grit his teeth. "I'm not ready for this, Zangetsu." Zangetsu pulled Ichigo's hands away, watching him steadily. "I ain't ever gonna forget who you were. Never, King." Were. He was inherently changed, and it was only getting worse. Ichigo gave his Hallow an unsteady smile. "Don't let me hurt him." Zangetsu looked insulted. "You don't have to ask, King." Thanks for watching this video. If you really enjoy this video, like, subscribe, and comment down below, and turn on that bell notification. Don't forget to support and follow the Shapooda for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story link in the description. See you in the next video. Goodbye.